72%. Let that number sit in the room with us for a moment before I tell you where it comes from. Out of more than 136,000 people in this country, all of them checked into a hospital in the middle of a heart attack. Tracked across 541 hospitals over 6 years, 72.1% of them walked in with a cholesterol number their own doctor would have looked at and called safe. Not borderline. Not something to keep an eye on. Safe. The kind of number you get on a slip of paper and feel a little relieved about, and then you go home and forget it. I want you to notice how strange that is, because we are not talking about people who might someday have heart trouble. We are talking about people who were, at that very moment, having it. The heart attack was already underway, and the one molecule we have spent 70 years teaching every doctor to circle in red on the lab report. The one number that built an entire industry of pills. The number that came to us from a little town in Massachusetts back in 1957. That number was sitting there looking perfectly ordinary in nearly 3 out of every 4 of them. Now, this is not some rumor I heard at a party. This study has been sitting quietly in a journal called the American Heart Journal since 2009. Anybody could read it. Most people never did. And I think that is because when a fact contradicts something you are absolutely certain of, the fact tends to slide right off you, like water off a duck. You do not even feel it land. So let me ask the obvious question, the one that keeps me up at night, or in your case, I suppose, the one that will very gently put you to sleep. If that famous molecule is not catching most of the people who are about to have a heart attack, then what would? What could you measure that would actually tell you something? And here is the part that sounds almost like a joke. There is a test. It costs nothing. Not $1. It takes about 90 seconds. You do not need a laboratory, or a needle, or a technician, or an appointment 3 weeks out. You need a wall. Any flat wall in this room would do. And the reason it works, the actual machinery of why standing still against a wall could tell you more about your heart than a vial of your own blood, is one of the strangest and prettiest pieces of physiology I know. We are going to take our time with it tonight. We have all the time in the world. But I do not want to just hand you the answer and have you take my word for it. That would be a cheap trick, and worse, you would not really believe it. You would nod along and forget it by morning. No. I want to do this properly. I want to start where everybody starts, which is believing completely in the cholesterol number. I want us both to feel how solid that belief is, how reasonable, how well built. Because it is well built. The people who put it together were not fools. They were careful, clever, honest scientists, and they had beautiful reasons for thinking what they thought. We are going to walk right into their world and get comfortable there. And then, very slowly, we are going to notice a crack. And then another. And by the time we are done, the whole comfortable picture is going to come apart in our hands, and we are going to build a better one from the pieces. So let us go back and stand in a doctor's office. Any doctor's office, anywhere in America, any time from around 1970 up to right now. You have had blood drawn. The little slip comes back. There is a column of numbers on it, and the doctor's eye goes straight to one of them, the cholesterol, and more specifically to a piece of it we call LDL. And there is a line drawn in the sand at a number. Below that line, you are, and I am quoting the language of the guidelines that ran for decades, not at high risk. Above it, the conversation gets serious. Maybe a pill, maybe a lecture about butter and eggs. That single number, above the line or below it, could change how you eat, how you worry, and whether you swallow something every morning for the rest of your life. Where did that line come from? Where did the whole idea come from? That a greasy little molecule floating in your blood is the thing to watch. It is a wonderful story, and like most wonderful stories in science, it did not arrive all at once. It got assembled, piece by piece, over almost 200 years by people who mostly had no idea what the next person would add. The oldest piece goes back to the year 1769. A French chemist named François Pelletier de la Salle was poking around at gallstones of all things. Now, a gallstone is a hard little pebble that forms in the body, and most people would just call it a nuisance. But he pulled out of it a waxy, pale substance, something that behaved like a fat but was not quite a fat. He had, without knowing what he had, laid his hands on cholesterol for the very first time. He did not name it. He just found it and set it down, and the world was not ready to understand it yet. It took another chemist, a man named Michel Eugène Chevreul, working in 1815, to give the stuff a name. He called it cholesterine, and if you know a little Greek, you can hear what he was thinking. Chole for bile. Steros for solid. The solid thing from the bile, a perfectly sensible name for a waxy pebble dweller. Nobody at that point had the faintest idea it had anything to do with the heart. Why would they? It came out of a gallstone. It was a curiosity for chemists, a substance to be catalogued and understood, sitting on a shelf next to 100 other newly named things. Then, in 1833, a man named Félix Henri Boudet found the same waxy substance somewhere new. He found it in human blood. And that is the moment the plot quietly thickens, though nobody heard the music swell. Because now this thing is not just hiding in gallstones. It is circulating inside all of us, right now in the river of the blood. Still, at that point, so what? Lots of things are in the blood. Finding a substance there is not the same as blaming it for anything. The blaming came later, and it came from rabbits. This is one of my favorite turns in the whole story. In 1912, a Russian scientist named Nikolai Anichkov took rabbits and fed them cholesterol. Straight dietary cholesterol, far more than a rabbit would ever encounter munching its way through a garden. And when he looked inside their arteries afterward, he found them furred up, thickened, diseased, in a way that looked remarkably like the clogged arteries doctors had been seeing in people who died of heart trouble. He had, for the first time, made the disease happen on purpose in a living animal by feeding it this one substance. Now that is a powerful thing to do in science. When you can cause a thing at will, you feel you have caught it by the tail. You feel you understand it. There is a wrinkle here that Anichkov could not have known, and it is worth tucking away in the back of your mind for later, because we will come back to it. A rabbit is a vegetarian. Its whole body is built to run on plants, and it almost never meets a load of animal cholesterol in its natural life. So stuffing a rabbit with the stuff is a bit like pouring maple syrup into the gas tank of your car and concluding that syrup is poisonous to all engines everywhere. Maybe it tells you something deep. Or maybe it just tells you that you have picked the wrong engine. Hold that thought. Fold it up and put it in your pocket. We are not done with it. The last big piece of the machinery clicked into place in 1949, and this one was a triumph of pure cleverness. Two scientists, John Goffman and Frank Lindgren, took a device called an ultracentrifuge, which is really just a spinner. A machine that whirls samples around so fast that the heavy things and the light things separate out, the way mud settles to the bottom of a still pond, only enormously faster and finer. And with that spinning, they managed to pull apart the different carriers that ferry fat and cholesterol around in the blood. They separated out the particle we now call LDL, the low-density one, the one that would eventually get painted as the villain and printed on the top line of your lab slip. And this right here is the thing you have to understand about why the whole idea felt so airtight, so unarguable for so long. Suddenly medicine had a target you could actually measure, not a vague feeling, not a guess. A specific particle, isolated by a specific machine, present in a specific amount in your blood, reproducible, countable, printable on a page. You could draw a line at a number, and human beings, doctors most of all, love a number they can draw a line at. It feels like knowledge. It feels like control. And for a long time, nobody had a good reason to doubt that the number on the page was telling the whole story. We are about to find out that it was not. So let me take you to a place where the number began, very quietly, to fall apart. Picture a great many hospitals scattered across a whole country. 541 of them to be exact. And picture the years rolling by, from the year 2000 up through 2006, 6 full years of people arriving at emergency doors clutching their chests, people in the middle of a heart attack, the very thing the number on the lab slip was supposed to warn them about. A physician at the medical school of the University of California at Los Angeles, a man named Greg Fonarow, decided to do something so simple it is almost embarrassing that nobody had made a loud fuss about it before. He said, "Let us gather up the records of these people. All of them. Every man and woman who came in with a heart attack. And let us look at what their cholesterol was when they arrived. Not months later. Not after treatment. Right then, at the door when the artery was already closing." Now think about how many people that turned out to be. 136,905 patients. That is not a small study you can wave away. That is a city's worth of heart attacks, all with their blood drawn, all with their numbers written down. And here is what the counting revealed, and I want you to sit with it, because it is the crack that runs right through the whole comfortable story I have been telling you. Of all those people having heart attacks, 72.1%, very nearly 3 out of every 4, had an LDL cholesterol below 130 milligrams per deciliter. Below the line. On the safe side of the fence. The good side. The side where the guidelines of the time patted you on the shoulder and said, "You are not at high risk." Let that settle for a moment in the dark. 3 out of 4 people whose hearts were failing them right at that instant would have looked at their own lab slip a week earlier and felt reassured. The number told them they were fine. The number was, by its own rules, behaving itself. And the artery closed anyway. It gets stranger still. Fonarow and his colleagues looked not just at the LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, but also at the HDL, the one people call the good kind, the one that is supposed to be protective, the one you want to be high. And they asked, how many of these heart attack patients had both numbers in the ideal range, low bad cholesterol and high good cholesterol, the perfect pairing, the gold star on the report card? The answer was fewer than 2 out of every 100, fewer than 2%. Which you might read, if you are still clinging to the old story, as proof that the numbers worked. See, the people with heart attacks did not have the perfect numbers. But turn it over in your hands and look at the other face of it. Almost none of these people had the textbook danger signal blazing away. Their cholesterol was, for the most part, unremarkable. Ordinary. The kind of number that gets a nod and a see you next year. And they had heart attacks all the same. Now, I am not going to stand here and tell you cholesterol means nothing. That would be a foolish overcorrection, and I have no patience for trading one oversimple story for another oversimple story. The particle is real. It does things in the artery wall. The rabbits of 1912 were not lying to us. But what this enormous pile of hospital records is whispering, and it is whispering rather than shouting because these results were published quietly in a medical journal in January of 2009 and did not exactly stop traffic, what it is whispering is this. The number on the top line of your lab slip is not the whole story. It was never the whole story. It is one thread pulled out of a rope. And somebody held up that single thread and said, "Behold, the rope." And we believed it, because the thread was measurable and the rest of the rope was not. At least, not yet. Not in a way anyone had thought to print on a page. So if the cholesterol number is only one thread, we are forced to ask a rather uncomfortable question. Is there something else? Some other measurement? Some other property of a living body that tells you more, that predicts more honestly who is going to be all right and who is not? And here is where the story takes a turn that I find genuinely delightful, because the answer, when it came, did not come from a test tube at all. It did not come from a machine spinning blood into layers. It came from something you can do with your own 2 legs. Let me walk you toward it slowly. In the year 2002, in one of the most respected medical journals in the world, a group led by a researcher named Jonathan Myers published a study that ought to have rearranged the furniture in every doctor's office in the land. They took 6,213 men. All of them had been sent for a treadmill test, the kind where they put you on a moving belt and make it steeper and faster while they watch your heart. And then, and this is the crucial part, they simply waited. They followed these men for an average of 6.2 years to see who lived and who died. Over that stretch, 1,256 of them died, and the researchers asked a plain question. Of everything we measured about these men, What best predicted which ones would still be here? Now you already know the usual suspects. Cholesterol, of course. Blood pressure, whether they smoked, their age, their weight, all the familiar faces from the guideline pamphlets. But there was one more thing they had measured almost as a matter of routine, because it is what a treadmill test measures. How much work the man's body could actually do. His exercise capacity. How far up that climbing, quickening belt he could go before he had to stop. And when they laid all the predictors side by side and asked which one carried the most weight, the winner was not cholesterol. The winner was not blood pressure. The winner was exercise capacity. How much the body could do. They put a number on it, and it is a number worth carrying with you into sleep. Physiologists measure exercise capacity in units called METs. You do not need to fuss over the exact definition tonight. Think of 1 MET as roughly the amount of energy your body burns just sitting quietly, doing nothing, keeping the lights on. Everything you do that is more strenuous than sitting is measured in multiples of that. Walking briskly might be 3 or 4 METs. Climbing stairs, more. Running hard, more still. And what Myers and his colleagues found was that for every single 1 MET improvement in a man's exercise capacity, his chance of surviving improved by about 12%. 1 rung up the ladder of fitness, 12% better odds. 2 rungs, and the effect compounds. The fitter man was not a little safer. He was dramatically, measurably, reliably safer, and the ledger did not much care what his cholesterol happened to be. The authors did not hedge and mumble about it either, which I admire. They wrote in plain language that exercise capacity was a more powerful predictor of death among these men than the other established risk factors for heart disease. And they meant, when they said the other risk factors, they meant cholesterol among them. They put it in writing. The thing your legs can do told you more about whether you would be alive in 6 years than the number the machine spun out of your blood. So now we have 2 facts sitting next to each other in the dark, and they are starting to lean toward one another like 2 cards about to make an arch. Fact 1. 3 out of 4 people having heart attacks had cholesterol numbers that looked perfectly safe. Fact 2. When you actually want to predict who lives and who dies, the capacity of the body to do physical work beats cholesterol soundly. You feel the ground beginning to shift, don't you? The number we trusted, the number we drew our line at, the number we printed on the top of the page, is being quietly outperformed by something the page never bothered to measure. And I want to be honest with you about what kind of shift this is, because it matters. This is not one clever study against the whole weight of medicine. If it were only Myers, only 6,000 men, only 6 years, you would be right to be cautious, to wait, to fold your arms and say, 1 swallow does not make a summer. Good instinct. Hold on to it. But this is where the story stops being a single crack and starts being a pattern in the wall, because Myers was not alone and the treadmill was not the only place people went looking, and what they kept finding over and over in study after study in country after country was the same stubborn thing. The body's ability to move, to work, to endure, to push against a load was telling the truth about the heart more faithfully than any single molecule floating in the blood. We are going to follow that pattern all the way down into millions of lives measured and counted, and then, once you believe it in your bones, I am going to show you the strangest part of all, which is that some of the most powerful evidence of your heart's true condition can be read not from years of treadmill tests, but from something as still, as silent, as almost absurdly simple as pressing your back against a wall and refusing to stand up. Stay with me in the quiet, and we will get there. Let us start with the biggest pile of evidence I know of, because when you are trying to decide whether something is true, it helps to stop looking at one study and start looking at a mountain of them. In the year 2024, somebody did a very sensible thing. They gathered up 26 separate meta-analyses. And remember, a meta-analysis is already a stack of studies bundled together, so this was a stack of stacks, a pile of piles. Underneath it all sat 199 long-term studies of ordinary human beings, followed for years, and when you add up every person in every one of those studies, you get around 20.9 million observations. 20.9 million. That is not a village. That is not a town. That is a number of people larger than most countries. And what did all those millions say, with one quiet voice? They said this: if you take the people whose bodies could work hard, whose hearts and lungs could carry them up a hill without quitting, and you compare them to the people whose bodies gave out early, the fit ones died of all causes at a rate somewhere between 41 and 53% lower. Let me let that sit in the dark for a moment. Cut your chance of dying from anything at all roughly in half, not by swallowing a molecule, by being able to move. And if you narrow the lens to the heart, to death from the cardiovascular system itself, and you look at people who already had heart disease, the ones with high fitness had a risk of dying that was 73% lower. The number they wrote down was a hazard ratio of 0.27. Now, I do not want to bury you in the arithmetic of statisticians, so let me just translate that plainly. Among people whose hearts were already in trouble, the ones who could still do physical work were dying at barely a quarter of the rate of the ones who could not. The very group we are most frightened for, the very group we medicate the hardest, and their fate hinged, more than on almost anything else, on whether their body could still push. There is a unit hiding underneath all of this, and I want to introduce it to you gently because it is going to keep showing up like a familiar face at a party. It is called the MET. That is just a little bookkeeping word scientists use to measure how much work your body can do. One MET is you sitting perfectly still, doing nothing, alive and idling like a car at a red light. 2 METs is a slow stroll, climbing stairs briskly, digging in the garden, that is up around 5 or 6. It is simply a ruler for effort. And here is the thing that ruler kept measuring across all those millions of lives. For every single 1 MET gain in what your body could do, one more notch of capacity, one more flight of stairs you could climb without stopping, your risk of dying from any cause fell by somewhere between 11 and 17%. And your risk of your heart failing, that slow drowning where the pump can no longer keep up, dropped by 18%. One notch. One rung on the ladder of what you can physically do. That is the exchange rate between effort and years. Now you might say to me, all right, but that is the heart and the lungs, that is the endurance machinery, the running and the climbing and the breathing hard. What about raw strength? What about the simple, unglamorous question of whether your muscles can pull and hold and press against a load? Surely that is a separate thing, a matter for people who want big arms, not a matter of life and death. Well, let us go and look, because somebody did. In the year 2008, a group of researchers, Ruiz and Sue and Blair among them, published a study that followed 8,762 men. And they did not follow them for a season or two. They followed them for a mean of 18.9 years, almost 2 decades of watching, waiting, recording. Over that long stretch, 503 of those men died. And the researchers had done something clever at the very beginning. They had measured how strong these men were. Then they sorted them into thirds. The strongest third, the middle third, and the weakest third. Here is what came back out of those 19 years. The men in the strongest third were dying, from all causes, at a rate roughly 23 to 28% lower than the weakest third. The number on the page was a hazard ratio somewhere around 0.72 to 0.77, and for death from the heart and vessels specifically, the strongest men sat at about 0.71, meaning close to 30% fewer of them died that way, just from being strong. But I have saved the part that should make you sit up in the quiet even as you are drifting off. Because the easy objection, the one a clever skeptic throws at you, is this: oh, well, strong men are probably also fit men. They probably also have good hearts and lungs. You are just measuring fitness again, wearing a different costume. And the researchers had thought of exactly that. So they did the hard statistical work of holding fitness constant. They adjusted for cardiorespiratory fitness. They adjusted for body mass. They adjusted for smoking. And, listen closely, they adjusted for high cholesterol. They took cholesterol, the king of the risk factors, the number your doctor circles in red, and they mathematically held it still, froze it in place, so it could not explain the result. And after all of that, after subtracting the heart, the lungs, the weight, the cigarettes, and the cholesterol, the strength signal was still standing there, still predicting who would live and who would die. Strength was telling the truth on its own, in its own voice, independent of everything we usually pay attention to. So now we have a pattern, and it is no longer a crack in the plaster. It is the whole wall showing its true shape. The ability of your body to endure predicts your survival. The ability of your body to exert force predicts your survival. And both of them keep predicting even after you scrub the cholesterol number right out of the equation. The molecule in the blood is not lying to us exactly. It is just one voice in a large choir, and we spent 70 years listening to it as if it were singing solo. Now I want to turn us, slowly, toward the machinery of why, because it is one thing to count the dead and notice a pattern, and it is a finer thing to understand the plumbing that produces it. And here I want you to stop thinking about cholesterol as a chemistry problem for a while and start thinking about your arteries as a plumbing problem. A mechanical thing. Pipes. Pressure. Force pushing outward on walls. Picture the arteries in your body not as abstract lines in a diagram, but as real tubes, elastic and living, carrying a fluid under pressure. Every time your heart squeezes, it sends a pulse of pressure down those tubes, and the walls of the tubes bulge a little and then spring back. Do that once, it is nothing. Do that 100,000 times a day, every day, for 70 years, and the question of how hard that pressure pushes becomes one of the most important questions in your whole body. A pipe under gentle pressure lasts a very long time. A pipe under high pressure, pounding, straining, stretching its walls past where they want to go, wears out. It stiffens, it cracks in its lining, and those cracks, those little injuries in the smooth inner surface, are precisely where trouble begins to gather. So the pressure itself, the raw mechanical force, is a villain in this story in a way that a floating molecule can never quite be. Because the molecule is just cargo. The pressure is the hammer, and your body, being far cleverer than we usually give it credit for, has built machinery specifically to sense that pressure and manage it. Buried in the walls of certain arteries, up near your neck and in the arch of the great vessel leaving your heart, there are tiny stretch detectors called baroreceptors. That word just means pressure catchers. When the pressure rises and the vessel wall stretches, these little detectors fire off signals to your brain, and the brain reads them like a gauge on a boiler and adjusts. Too high, it says, ease off, and it dials down the nervous signals that keep your vessels tight, and the pressure settles. But here is a thing that most people never hear, and it is going to matter enormously for where we are going. That gauge, that pressure sensing system, is not fixed at the factory. It is not a setting stamped into you at birth that you are stuck with forever. It can be dulled. It can be sharpened. It can be retrained. The brain's whole notion of what counts as normal pressure, the set point it defends, can be moved. And there is a wire, a specific measurable thing that connects your daily habits of movement to the tightness of your vessels at rest. Scientists can actually push a fine electrode into a nerve and listen to the traffic of signals running out to the blood vessels telling them how hard to clench. They call that traffic muscle sympathetic nerve activity. And that traffic, that constant murmur of the nervous system telling your pipes to squeeze, is the lever. Turn it down, and the pipes relax, and the pressure at rest falls, and the hammer strikes softer, day after day, year after year. Which raises the only question that matters now. If the pressure is the villain, and the nervous traffic is the lever, and the pressure gauge in your arteries can be retrained, then what exactly retrains it best? What is the stimulus that reaches in and turns that lever down and resets that gauge? And this is where the whole story is about to do something you will not see coming, because the answer is not the thing that leaves you sweating and gasping. The answer is quieter than that, stranger than that. Stay with me in the dark and let us go and find it. Picture two people standing at the bottom of a hill. One of them decides to run to the top as fast as their legs will carry them. Their breath tears in and out. Their heart is slamming, their face goes red. By the time they reach the crest, they are bent over, hands on knees, gulping at the sky. Now the second person does something that looks almost lazy by comparison. They walk over to a tree, they put their back flat against the trunk, they slide down until their thighs are level, as though sitting in a chair that is not there, and then they simply hold. They do not move. They do not run anywhere. From across the field, you might think nothing at all is happening to them. And if I told you that the second person, the still one, the one who went nowhere, was doing more to lower the resting pressure in their arteries than the runner gasping at the summit, you would look at me the way my students used to look at me when I said the future and the past are not as different as they feel. You would think I had lost the thread. So let me earn the claim, because it is a strange one, and I do not want you to take it on my say-so. I want you to see the numbers the way the people who gathered them saw the numbers, and then decide for yourself whether the still person or the sweating person has the better case. There is a university on the southern coast of England in a town called Canterbury, and a group of researchers there led by a man named Jamie Edwards set out to settle an argument that had been simmering quietly for years. The argument was simple to state. If you want to bring down a person's blood pressure without a single pill, what kind of movement should you tell them to do? Everybody had an opinion. The heart doctors mostly said, go for a walk, go for a jog, get that pulse up, do what we call aerobic exercise. The people who liked the gymnasium said lift weights, do your dynamic resistance, push and pull against a load. And a smaller stranger group off in the corner kept saying, no, no, you have got it backwards. The best thing is to hold still against a resistance and not move at all. That is the isometric camp. Iso meaning same, matric meaning length. Same length. The muscle strains with everything it has, and yet it does not shorten, it does not lengthen, it holds. A wall sit is the purest example of it you can imagine. Now the trouble with arguments like this is that any single study can be a fluke. You run one small trial, you get a number, and the number might be a trick of who happened to walk into your clinic that month. So what Edwards and his colleagues did was gather up the trials. Not one, not 10, 270 separate randomized controlled trials. That is the good kind, the kind where you flip a coin to decide who gets the treatment, so that your own hopes cannot bend the result. And across all those trials they pulled together 15,827 human beings. That is a small town's worth of people, every one of them measured, before and after, for what their arteries were doing at rest. And then they did the thing that makes this kind of study worth the trouble. They did not just ask, does exercise lower blood pressure? Everybody already knew the answer to that. They asked a sharper question. They lined all the different kinds of exercise up against each other, side by side, in the same analysis on the same scale, and they asked, which one wins? Which one moves the number the most? Let me give you the results the way you would read them off the page, and I want you to hold each one in your mind for a moment as it goes by, because the shape of these numbers is the whole story. The runners, the aerobic people, the joggers, and the brisk walkers brought the top number of blood pressure down by about 4.5 millimeters of mercury. That is a real effect. That is nothing to sneeze at. A doctor would be glad to see it. The people doing the fashionable thing, the high-intensity intervals, the sprint and rest that everybody was so excited about, they came in at about 4 points down, a hair less than the joggers, near enough to call it even. The weightlifters, the dynamic resistance crowd, came in around 4.5 again, and if you combine training, aerobic and resistance together, you could push it to about 6 down. So now you have a little cluster of numbers, all of them in the same neighborhood, all of them respectable, 4, 4.5, 6. And then you come to the still people, the ones holding against the wall, going nowhere, looking for all the world like they are doing the least. 8.25 millimeters of mercury off the top number. More than the joggers, more than the intervals, more than the weights, more than the combination. The exercise that looked like the least did the most. I want to sit inside that reversal for a minute, because it is so contrary to everything the body seems to be telling you. When you run, you feel it. Your heart pounds, your lungs burn, your legs ache, and every one of those sensations is your body shouting, I am doing something enormous. When you hold a wall sit, past the first minute your thighs begin to tremble and burn. Yes, but your heart is not slamming the way it does on the hill. Your breath is not ragged, and the whole affair has a quiet, almost meditative stillness to it. And yet the still one is the one that reaches into your arteries and turns the pressure down further and holds it down longer. The feeling of effort and the fact of benefit have come uncoupled. They are not the same thing. They were never the same thing. We only assumed they were because sweat and gasping are so vivid and stillness is so easy to overlook. Now, when a single result comes out this backwards, a good scientist does not celebrate. A good scientist gets suspicious. So the Edwards group did the honest thing and asked, how sure are we really? And here is where the statistics have a lovely way of speaking. They ran the whole comparison thousands of times over, shuffling the uncertainty, asking again and again, if we had to bet, which modality is truly the best at bringing the top number down. And the isometric holds came out on top not once in a while, but 98 times out of 100. 98% of the time, when you accounted for every wobble in the data, the still exercise was the winner. That is about as close to a clean verdict as this kind of research ever gives you. Nature almost never says yes this loudly. But they went further still, and this is the part I find delicious, because they zoomed in inside the isometric camp itself, because holding still against a wall is not the only way to hold still against something. You can squeeze a spring in your hand. You can push your leg against a fixed bar. There are several ways to strain without moving, so which of those was the champion of champions? Which single, specific, ordinary movement rose above all the others? It was the one against the wall. The wall squat, the wall sit, the thing a schoolchild does in a physical education class as a punishment. When they ranked all the isometric methods, the wall sit stood at the top, with something like a 90% probability of being the single best submode for bringing that top number down. The punishment exercise, the thing you can do in a hallway with no equipment, in your ordinary clothes in the time it takes a kettle to boil. That is the one the mountain of data pointed to. Why should that be? Why the wall of all things? And here we get our first real clue about the mechanism, though we are going to spend a long, unhurried while later tonight taking it fully apart. The answer, at least the beginning of the answer, is muscle. Bulk. Territory. When you squeeze a spring in your fist, you are commanding a modest little parcel of muscle in your forearm to strain. Useful, but small. When you sink into that invisible chair against the wall, look at what you have recruited. The great slabs of the quadriceps down the front of each thigh. The glutes behind you, some of the most powerful muscle you own. The hamstrings, the calves, all of it lit up at once and locked in place. You have, in one quiet posture, put more of your body under strain than almost any other single thing you could do while standing still. And that mass, that acreage of straining tissue, turns out to matter enormously for what happens next in the blood vessels. The bigger the parcel of muscle you clamp down and then release, the bigger the flood that follows, and the bigger the message that flood sends to the walls of your arteries. We will come to that flood. It is one of the prettiest pieces of plumbing in the whole body. For now, hold on to the shape of what we have just found, because it overturns something you have believed since you were a child. You were taught, one way or another, that the value of exercise is written in how hard it feels, that the burn is the point, that the gasp is the proof, that the more you suffer, the more you gain. And here is a mountain of careful evidence, 15,000 people deep, saying that the stillest, quietest, least dramatic thing on the menu, the thing that barely raises your pulse, the thing you could do while thinking about something else entirely, is the one that speaks most directly to the pressure inside your pipes. The suffering was never the mechanism. The suffering was just a feeling that sometimes rode alongside the mechanism, and sometimes, as here, wandered off and left the mechanism to work in silence. So the question sharpens, the way a good question always does when you answer the one before it. If the wall sit is the champion, and the champion works by holding still and then letting go, then what is happening in those 90 seconds of the hold, second by second, inside the arteries, inside the muscle, inside the nerves, that turns a punishment into medicine? Because something quite violent is going on in there while you sit so peacefully against that wall. The pressure inside you is not resting at all. It is climbing, and climbing toward a number that would alarm you if you saw it on a machine. And that climb, that alarming, temporary climb, is not the danger. It is the whole trick. Let us go inside the hold and watch it happen. Picture yourself sliding down the wall until your knees bend to something near a right angle, thighs parallel to the floor, back flat against the plaster, and nothing moving at all. To anyone watching, you are doing nothing. You are a piece of furniture. But the stillness is a costume, and underneath it your legs have just declared a small emergency. The big muscles of the thigh, the quadriceps across the front, the glutes behind, the hamstrings underneath, have all clenched at once and refuse to let go. And when a muscle clenches hard and stays clenched, it does something rather rude to the blood vessels threaded through it. It squeezes them shut. Not all the way, not everywhere, but enough. The muscle becomes its own tourniquet. It is strangling its own supply lines while at the very same moment demanding more fuel than it has ever wanted in its life. That is the contradiction sitting at the heart of the hold, and every second you stay down there, the contradiction sharpens. Now think about what the heart must do about this. Downstream, in the thigh, the little vessels are being pinched. To the pump upstairs, that pinching looks like resistance, like a hose someone is standing on. So the pump does the only thing a pump can do when the pipe narrows and the tissue still cries out for delivery. It pushes harder. The pressure rises, and here is where the numbers become vivid. Because in a room full of young adults, average age about 26 and a half, researchers measured exactly this. At rest, before anyone moved, their pressure sat at a comfortable 121/77. That is the number a doctor would smile at. Then they had them sit against the wall, and they watched the pressure climb, not gently. On average, it rose to 164/104, and at the peak, in the hardest moments, it reached 189/123. If you saw that on a machine in a quiet clinic, you would think something had gone terribly wrong. You would think the person was in danger. But nothing has gone wrong. This is the astonishing part, and I want you to sit with it the way you are sitting against that imaginary wall. The very same pressure that would be a 5-alarm warning if it lived in your arteries all day long is, for these 90 seconds, precisely the signal your body needs. It is a controlled fire, lit on purpose, in a fireplace built to hold it. The danger of high blood pressure is not the height, it is the duration. It is pressure that never comes down, grinding against the vessel walls hour after hour, year after year, the way a river that never falls will eventually cut a canyon through solid rock. A brief spike is a different animal entirely. A brief spike is a stimulus. It is a knock on the door. And what answers that door is the machinery we are about to meet. Let me tell you how the body even knows the muscle is in trouble. Because it is not obvious. Buried inside the muscle tissue are two kinds of tiny nerve endings, and they are the informants in this story. The first kind feels pressure and stretch and squeezing. Think of them as little strain gauges, sensitive to force, reporting on the mechanical world inside the meat. Physiologists call these the group 3 fibers, but you can just think of them as the ones that feel the squeeze. The second kind is a chemical detective. As the muscle works without enough fresh blood, it starts to stew in its own byproducts, the waste of hard effort, the acids and metabolites that pile up when demand outruns supply. The second kind of nerve ending tastes that chemical broth and sounds the alarm. Those are the group 4 fibers, the ones that smell the exhaust. Between the two of them, the squeeze detectors and the chemical detectors, your muscle sends a message racing up the spinal cord to the brain that says, in effect, we are working down here, we are choking, send help, and send it now. The brain's answer to that message is what drives the pressure up. It leans on the sympathetic nervous system, the branch that handles urgency, and it tells the heart to beat harder and tells vessels elsewhere to tighten, so that the whole system pushes more blood at higher pressure toward the struggling legs. This whole reflex, the muscle crying out and the body cranking up the pressure in response, has a name. It is called the exercise pressor reflex, and for 90 seconds it turns a person sitting perfectly still into a body running an internal sprint. The heart does not know you are motionless. The heart only knows the legs are screaming, and it responds as if you were fleeing something. Now watch what happens at the moment you cannot hold anymore. Because you will not hold forever. In that same study of young adults, Nearly everyone, 98 of every 100, reached the safety ceiling the researchers had set on the lower number, the diastolic pressure, at 115. And they reached it on average at about 53 seconds. The men held a little longer, around 65 seconds. The women a little less, around 42. And you notice already that 90 seconds begins to look like something special, something past where most people tap out. But set that aside for a moment, because I want you to feel the release itself. You stand up, or you let the legs give way and you sink to the floor. The clench ends. And in that instant, every vessel you had been pinching shut springs open at once. The tourniquet releases, and all the blood that had been dammed up, all the flow the pump had been straining to force through narrowed pipes, comes rushing in at once. Physiologists have a lovely name for this flood. They call it reactive hyperemia, which only means an eager, overflowing rush of blood into tissue that was just starved of it. The muscle, which a second ago was choking, is now drenched, drowning in delivery. And that flood is not a side effect. That flood is the medicine finally being poured. Here is why. The inside wall of every blood vessel is lined with a single delicate layer of cells, a living wallpaper called the endothelium. This lining is not passive. It feels the blood moving across it, the way your cheek feels wind. When the flow is gentle, it feels a gentle drag. When the flow suddenly surges, when reactive hyperemia sends a torrent racing along that inner wall, the lining feels a hard scraping force, a friction of fluid against surface that scientists call shear stress. And the endothelium loves that scraping. It responds to it by manufacturing a small, short-lived molecule, a gas actually, called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is the body's own relaxant for blood vessels. It seeps into the muscular wall of the artery and tells it to loosen, to widen, to let go of its tension. The vessel dilates. It opens. So the sequence, if you step back and watch the whole dance, goes like this. You squeeze the pipes shut, you let them go. The blood floods back. The flood scrapes the lining. The lining releases nitric oxide. The vessels relax. That is one repetition. That is what a single hold and release actually does inside you, underneath the stillness, underneath the ache. The punishment was building pressure so that the release could deliver a flood, and the flood was the point all along. And you might ask, fairly, so what? So a vessel relaxes for a few minutes after I stand up. How does that turn into a lower number on a doctor's cuff weeks later, months later, sitting quietly at rest? That is the deepest part of the mechanism, and it is worth slowing down for, because it is where a passing event becomes a permanent change. When you do this not once but again and again, 4 holds of a couple of minutes each, 3 days a week, week after week, something in the nervous system itself begins to shift. Remember that sympathetic branch, the urgency system, the one that cranked the pressure up during the hold. At rest, in an untrained person, that system keeps a certain baseline tension on the vessels all day long, a constant low hum of tightening that physiologists measure and call muscle sympathetic nerve activity. It is one of the quiet levers that sets your resting blood pressure. And repeated isometric training turns that hum down. The chronic outflow of tightening signals to the vessels is attenuated, quieted, reduced. The system that had been holding your pipes a little too taut around the clock learns to ease its grip, so the resting tone drops. The pipes sit a little wider by default, not just for the 10 minutes after a hold, but as a new normal, a lower setting on the thermostat. And that is the whole arc of it. From a single 90-second act of stubbornness against a wall, through the strain gauges and the chemical detectives and the pump straining upstairs, through the flood and the scraping and the gas that relaxes the wall, all the way to a nervous system that has quietly reset how hard it squeezes you when you are doing nothing at all. The violence of the hold and the peace that follows are not opposites. They are the same event seen at its two ends. And once you understand that the spike was never the enemy, that the alarming climb toward 189 was the knock that summoned the cure, you start to see why the still exercise, the one that looks like laziness, could possibly outperform the running and the sweating. But there is a piece of this reset we have not yet touched, a part of the machinery even more elegant than the vessels themselves, and it lives not in the legs, but in the throat, in a cluster of sensors that decide every single second what your blood pressure is even allowed to be. Let me take you up there, into the throat, because this is one of those places in the body where nature did something so clever that when you finally see it, you want to laugh. There is a spot on each side of your neck where the big artery that carries blood up to your brain divides into two. That fork, that little branching, has a slightly swollen wall, a bulge, and buried inside that bulge are nerve endings that do only one thing. They feel stretch. They do not taste, they do not measure chemistry, they do not count anything. They simply report, moment by moment, how much the wall around them is being pushed outward. And since the wall gets pushed outward exactly as hard as the blood is pressing on it, these little sensors are, in effect, pressure gauges. They are the pressure gauges your body built for itself long before anyone thought to wrap a cuff around an arm. These sensors are called baroreceptors, and the word just means pressure catchers. Every heartbeat, the pressure inside that artery rises and falls, and the wall stretches and relaxes, and the baroreceptors fire off a little burst of signals up a nerve into the base of the brain. When the pressure climbs, they fire faster. When it drops, they go quiet. And down in the brainstem, in a region that never sleeps and never asks your permission, those signals are read and acted upon within a single heartbeat. Pressure too high, the brain says, ease off, slow the heart a touch, loosen the vessels. Pressure too low, it says, squeeze, speed up, tighten. It is a thermostat, except instead of holding a room at a comfortable temperature, it holds your arteries at a comfortable pressure, and it does the whole job in less time than it takes you to blink. Now here is where it gets interesting, and here is why I brought you all the way up to the neck. A thermostat has a setting. Somebody decided the room should be kept at a certain warmth, and the thermostat defends that number. Your baroreceptor system also has a setting, a pressure it considers normal and worth defending. And the trouble with high blood pressure, the deep and quiet trouble, is not just that the pressure is high. It is that the thermostat has come to believe the high pressure is correct. It has stopped treating the high number as an emergency. It has quietly moved its own setting upward, and now it defends the sickness as if it were health. The gauge still works. The gauge is fine. But the gauge has been told that the wrong answer is the right one. So when we talk about resetting blood pressure, we are really talking about two different things, and it is worth pulling them apart slowly, because this is the part almost nobody explains. One thing is simply making the pressure lower for a while. You can do that with a hot bath, with a quiet afternoon, with a deep breath. The other thing, the thing that actually matters, is changing what the senses consider normal. Convincing the thermostat that the lower number is the one worth defending. The first is a mood. The second is a cure. And the astonishing finding buried in the research is that the still exercise, the wall sit, the stubborn hold against nothing, seems to do the second thing. It does not merely nudge the pressure down for an hour. It appears to reach up into the neck and re-educate the gauge. How would you even measure such a thing, whether a person's pressure sensors have gotten sharper or duller? It is a lovely little experiment in principle. You watch, beat by beat, what happens to the heart when the pressure naturally rises a bit and then falls a bit. A sensitive, well-tuned system responds crisply. Pressure ticks up, the very next beats slow down, promptly, obediently, by a good amount. A dull, badly tuned system barely bothers. Pressure ticks up, and the heart shrugs, slows a little, late, half-heartedly. So you can put a number on the sharpness of the gauge. You can measure how many milliseconds the heart lengthens its beat. For every small unit, the pressure rises. That ratio is baroreceptor sensitivity, and it is a way of asking, in plain arithmetic, how alert the thermostat is. And when they trained people on isometric holes and then measured this alertness before and after, the change was not small. In the men, the sensitivity of the gauge went up roughly 16-fold. 16 times sharper. A system that had been dozing at its post, half ignoring the pressure it was supposed to guard, woke up and started responding 16 times more vigorously to the same nudge. Think about what that means. It is not that the muscles got a little stronger or the vessels a little looser, though those things happen too. It is that the control system itself, the referee, the part of you that decides what your pressure is even allowed to be, was recalibrated by nothing more than a series of quiet, motionless struggles against a wall. In the women, the same training sharpened the gauge too, though by a more modest amount, something closer to 3.5 times. And I want to be honest with you here, in the calm way we have been honest all along, because I do not fully know why the two numbers differ so much, and neither really does anyone else yet. It may be differences in muscle mass, in hormones, in how the nervous system is wired, in the size of the vessels themselves. It is one of those genuine open corners of the subject, and I would rather leave it standing there, honestly unexplained, than paper over it with a confident story I cannot back up. What is not in doubt is the direction. In both cases, the sensors woke up. In both cases, the thermostat was persuaded to care again. Now let me connect this back to the violence we watched earlier, because it all fits together into one picture, and the picture is beautiful. During the hold, the pressure climbs up toward 160, 180, higher than you might like to see it, and the baroreceptors, doing their honest job, scream. They fire like mad. They are stretched hard, they report the strain, they beg the brainstem to bring it down. But you keep holding. You override them, gently, with your stubbornness. And so, over and over, session after session, the gauge is exercised. It is stretched to its limits and made to fire at full volume again and again, the way you might exercise any part of the body by loading it and releasing it. A sensor that is regularly driven to its extremes and asked to respond does not go dull. It goes sharp. You are, in the most literal sense, giving your pressure sensors a workout, right alongside your legs. There is a poetry to that which I cannot resist pausing on. The very moment that looks most dangerous, the peak of the pressure spike, the instant a nervous doctor might tell you to stop, is precisely the moment that trains the safety system. The alarm bell, rung hard and often, becomes a better alarm bell. The system learns its own range by being pushed through it, and when it is over, when you release, and the flood comes and the vessels relax, the newly sharpened gauge settles into a lower resting belief about what normal should be. It has been shown through the exercise that lower pressures are survivable, are ordinary, are nothing to squeeze against. And so it stops squeezing. Day by day, week by week, the setting drifts back down toward where it belonged all along. This is why I keep insisting that the spike and the calm are the same event seen from two ends. The spike is not damage you endure in exchange for the benefit. The spike is the mechanism of the benefit. Without the climb, there is no reason for the sensors to fire hard, no stretch to sharpen them, no training of the gauge. The stillness of the exercise hides a tremendous amount of internal motion. On the outside, a person sitting against a wall, thighs parallel to the floor, looking as though they have simply gotten tired and slid down. On the inside, a heart working harder, vessels clamped and then flung open, chemistry pouring off the vessel walls, and up in the neck, in that little branching bulge, thousands of sensors firing at the top of their voices and in the firing being remade. And once you hold that image in your mind, a certain old assumption starts to look very strange. We have spent 70 years measuring a greasy molecule floating in the blood and calling that the report card of the heart, a still photograph of one chemical. Meanwhile, the thing that actually governs whether your arteries stay supple or stiffen, whether your pressure sits low or grinds high year after year, is not a molecule you can pipette out and weigh. It is a behavior. It is the moment-to-moment conversation between muscle, vessel, and that vigilant cluster of gauges in the throat. A conversation you can join and change with a few motionless minutes a week. The molecule you can only observe, the conversation you can actually enter. So we have followed the reset from the legs, where the struggle begins, up through the flooding vessels, and now all the way to the brainstem's thermostat and the sensors that feed it. But there is still a question I have been quietly holding back. The sort of question a careful person always asks after hearing a claim this good. If the still exercise is really this powerful, then it ought to win in a fair fight, out in the open, against the running and the sweating and the huffing that everyone has been told is the real medicine. It ought to be measurable, not in one clever laboratory, but across hundreds of trials and thousands of people, with all the messiness that real evidence brings. So let us go and look at exactly that fight and see whether the champion holds up when the whole field lines up against it. So picture the arena. Not a laboratory this time, but something much larger. A kind of vast accounting of everything anyone has carefully measured about exercise and blood pressure. In the year 2023, a fellow named Jamie Edwards, working at Canterbury Christ Church University over in England, decided he was tired of the arguing. Everyone had a favorite. The runners swore by running. The weightlifting crowd swore by the barbell. The people who liked to sprint in short bursts, the ones who call it high-intensity interval training, swore that their gasping little intervals were the true medicine, and each of them could point to a study. That is the trouble with studies, you see. If you have enough of them, you can find one that says almost anything you please. So what do you do when everybody has a study? You gather up all the studies. You put them in one room and you make them talk to each other. That is what Edwards and his colleagues did. They pulled together 270 randomized controlled trials. Not 2, not 12, 270. And inside those trials were 15,827 people, ordinary people, being measured before and after their various exercises. Now this is a special kind of gathering, and I want you to appreciate the cleverness of it, because it is not just a pile, it is what they call a network. Suppose one trial pitted running against sitting still, and another pitted weightlifting against sitting still, and a third pitted running against weightlifting directly. You can stitch all of those comparisons together into a single web, and out of the web you can estimate how every method stacks up against every other method, even the ones that were never tested head-to-head in the same room. It is a bit like figuring out who is the fastest runner in the whole county when the runners never all raced at once. You know Anne beat Betty, you know Betty beat Carol. You can start to rank them carefully with all the proper hedging about the uncertainty. That is a network meta-analysis, and it is one of the more honest tools we have for settling a quarrel like this. So the whole field lined up. The aerobic exercise, the jogging and the cycling and the swimming, the stuff every doctor has been recommending for 50 years. When they averaged it all out, aerobic exercise brought the top number, the systolic pressure, down by about 4.49 millimeters of mercury, and the bottom number, the diastolic, down by about 2.53. Now that is real. I do not want you to hear me sneer at 4.5 points. If you could give 4.5 points to an entire population, you would prevent a great many strokes and a great many failing hearts. That is a genuine good. Hold on to that number, 4.49, because it is the number to beat. It is the champion everyone expected to win. Then the interval training stepped up, the fashionable one, the one that promises you enormous benefit from just a few minutes of misery. And it brought the top number down by about 4.08 and the bottom by about 2.5. So a little behind the plain jogging, if anything, and certainly not the miracle its advocates had promised. The dynamic resistance training, the lifting where you actually move the weight up and down, came in at about 4.55 on top and 3.04 on the bottom. A touch better than the jogging, respectable, nothing to be ashamed of. And then they tried combining things, aerobic plus resistance together, and that pairing managed about 6.04 on top and 2.54 on the bottom. Better still. Now the ranking is starting to look sensible, is it not? More exercise, more variety, more effort, a bigger reward. 6 points for doing 2 kinds of exercise. That is the story you would expect the universe to tell. And then the still exercise walked into the arena. The isometric training, the wall sit, the thing where you do not move at all, where you simply hold, where from the outside it looks as though nothing whatsoever is happening. And it brought the top number down by 8.24 millimeters of mercury and the bottom number by 4 points even. 8.25. Nearly double the jogging. Well ahead of the intervals, ahead of the lifting, ahead even of the combined training that had you doing 2 workouts at once. The exercise where you sit against a wall and stare at the far side of the room beat every sweating, huffing, moving thing in the entire field. The champion nobody nominated. The horse that was not even entered in the race. I want to pause here, because when a result comes in this far from expectation, the first thing an honest person feels is not delight. It is suspicion. That cannot be the whole story, you think. A fluke. One loud study drowning out the quiet ones. So the researchers asked the same question, only they asked it in the language of probability, which is the honest way to ask it. They said, given everything we have measured, what is the chance that isometric exercise is genuinely the single best method for bringing down that top number? And the answer came back at 98%. 98 out of 100. That is not a whisper. That is not a maybe. In the careful, hedging, deliberately timid world of medical statistics, 98% is very nearly a shout. The still exercise was not squeaking past the others by a nose. It was standing at the front of the field with almost the whole weight of the evidence behind it. But they went one layer deeper, and this is the part I find the most delicious, so let me lay it out slowly. Isometric exercise is not just one thing. There is the hand grip, where you squeeze a device in your fist and hold the squeeze. That is where much of the early work was done, because it is easy to measure a hand. There is the leg extension, where you hold your leg out straight against a resistance. And there is the wall sit, the wall squat, where you slide your back down the wall until your thighs are parallel to the floor and your knees are bent at something near a right angle, and you hold yourself there as though sitting in a chair that isn't there. So within the family of still exercises, which child does the best? They ran the numbers again, and the wall sit came out on top with a 90.5% probability of being the number one sub-method for lowering that top pressure. Not only did the still exercises beat the moving ones, the stillest, simplest, most equipment-free member of the whole still family, the one you can do against any wall in your house without spending a single dollar, beat its own siblings too. Now let me tell you why an old physicist finds this so satisfying, and it is not merely the surprise of it. It is that the surprise makes sense once you understand the machinery, and we have already built that machinery together in the last hour. Remember what the wall sit actually does. It recruits the biggest muscles you own, the great slabs of the quadriceps on the front of the thigh, the glutes behind you, the hamstrings underneath. That is an enormous mass of tissue, all of it clamping down at once, all of it squeezing its little blood vessels half shut, all of it screaming through those group 3 and group 4 nerve fibers up to the brainstem. The hand grip does the same thing in principle, but with a fistful of muscle. The wall sit does it with what may be the largest muscle group in the human body. Bigger clamp, bigger flood on release, bigger shear across the vessel walls, bigger call for that nitric oxide to pour out and relax the plumbing. The size of the muscle you engage sets the size of the signal you send. And so, in a study looking directly at this, the wall squat produced the largest drop in pressure in the minutes, right after the hold, larger than the hand grip, larger than the leg extension, when all of them were made to work at the same relative intensity. The plumbing does not care how heroic you look. It cares how much muscle you shut down and then reopen. The wall sit shuts down and reopens a great deal. So the suspicion, the honest suspicion I asked you to hold, has been answered. It was not one loud study. It was 270 trials and nearly 16,000 people, ranked by probability, pointing the same direction, and the mechanism we already understood explains exactly why the pointing goes the way it does. The champion held up in the open field. It won the fair fight. And yet, I have handed you an average. 8.25 points, averaged across thousands of strangers. An average is a strange, ghostly thing. It is nobody in particular. No single person in that study necessarily dropped exactly 8.24. Some dropped more, some dropped less, some barely moved. So the next question, the one that keeps me from simply resting on this splendid number, is what happens to one real person, in one real body, over a handful of real weeks. Not the ghost of the average, a person. What would you actually see if you took someone whose pressure ran too high and gave them nothing but this wall and these few motionless minutes and waited? Let us go and find that person and watch what happens to them day by day. So here is the person. Not a real name, of course, but let me build them out of the numbers we do have, because the numbers are honest even when the face is imaginary. Picture someone a little past 40, say 44 or 45, which is close to the average age of the 77 people who actually walked into that trial by Cohen and his colleagues. 2 out of every 3 of them were men, so let us make our person a man only because that is where the arithmetic points, and I like to follow the arithmetic. He is not sick. Exactly. He feels fine. He climbs stairs, he carries groceries, he laughs at jokes, but his blood pressure runs high, and nobody has put him on a single pill for it. That is important. He is unmedicated. Whatever happens to him over the next 12 weeks happens because of the wall and nothing else. No drug hiding in the background taking the credit. On the first day, someone measures him. The top number, the pressure when the heart squeezes, sits up where a doctor frowns at it. And then they show him what he is going to do, and it is almost insultingly simple. He puts his back flat against a wall. He slides down until his knees bend to about 95 degrees. Not quite the 90 we talked about before, a touch more open, a little kinder to the joint, but the same idea. Thighs working, back supported, feet planted, and then he simply stays there. 2 minutes. He rests. He does it again. 2 minutes. Rests. Again. And once more. 4 holds of 2 minutes each, with a couple of minutes of rest tucked between them so the legs can recover. That is the whole session. 3 times a week. And then he goes home and lives his life. Now I want you to feel how little this is, because the smallness of it is the whole scandal. 4 holds of 2 minutes is 8 minutes of actual work. Do that 3 times in a week, and you have spent something like 14 minutes leaning on a wall. 14 minutes. You could not get through the opening of most television programs in 14 minutes. You would still be in the part where they remind you what happened last time. And out of that quarter of an hour, spread across 7 days, we are about to ask nature for a favor that the pharmaceutical industry spends fortunes chasing. The first week, honestly, nothing dramatic announces itself. He holds the position, his legs burn a little near the end, that deep dull ache creeping up the front of the thigh, and he is glad when the 2 minutes end. Inside him, though, the machinery we described is already turning. Every hold squeezes those small vessels half shut. Every release lets the blood come roaring back across the lining of the arteries, dragging its palm along the inner wall, and that dragging, that shear, is quietly whispering to the vessel, "Make more of the molecule that relaxes me." He cannot feel any of that. Feeling is a poor instrument for this kind of change. The change is happening below the floor of sensation. By a few weeks in, if you measured him on the right afternoon, you would start to catch it. Not a single measurement, because a single measurement is noisy, it jumps around with coffee and worry and whether he ran for the bus. But the trend, the patient trend underneath the noise, has begun to bend downward. His nervous system, the part that keeps a constant low hum of tightening on the arteries, has started to ease that hum. The messengers that clench the vessels are being released a little less eagerly. His body, without asking his permission, is deciding that the walls do not need to be held quite so tight anymore. And at the end of the 12 weeks, they measure everyone again, the whole group of them, and then they do the thing that makes it science rather than a story. They compare. Because there was another group, you see, a group who did not do the wall at all. The control group. Same kind of people, same starting trouble, same weeks passing on the calendar, but no holes. And what happened to those people is almost the most instructive part of the whole affair. Over 12 weeks, their top number moved by 4/10 of 1 point. 4/10. That is nothing. That is the needle trembling. That is what happens when you simply wait and hope and change nothing. Time, all by itself, does not fix this. The calendar is not medicine, but the ones who leaned on the wall 3 afternoons a week, 14 minutes total, watching whatever they watched while they held their imaginary chair in the air, their top number came down by nearly 13 points. 12.9 to be exact about it. Set those two numbers side by side and let them sit there a moment. 4/10 of a point for doing nothing. Almost 13 points for doing the smallest thing I have ever described to you. That gap, that enormous gap, is not the wall being magical. The wall is not magical. That gap is the difference between an artery that is being asked, gently and repeatedly, to relax, and an artery that is simply being left alone with its bad habit. And I want to slow down on that 13. Because 13 points off the top number is not a cosmetic figure. This is not vanity. When you lower that pressure by 10 or so points across a population, you are talking about meaningfully fewer strokes, meaningfully fewer failing hearts, meaningfully fewer of the catastrophes that arrive without warning on an ordinary Tuesday. Doctors have chased that 10 points with tablets for half a century and been glad to get it, and here it comes strolling out of a wall. Now, I am a careful man, and I do not want to hand you one trial and let you build a cathedral on it. So let me widen the lens again, the way we did before. Because one study is a candle, and I would rather show you the room lit from several sides. When the reviewers gathered the wall squat work together, not just Cohen's people but the pooled picture, and asked what the wall specifically tends to deliver, the numbers landed a little gentler than that single dramatic trial, and that is exactly what you would expect. Averages across many rooms are always cooler than the hardest room. They found the wall squat bringing the top number down by something like 11.5 points, and the bottom number, the pressure between beats when the heart is resting and filling, down by about 5 points. So the two numbers move together. The vessel is not just less strained when the heart pushes. It is less clenched even in the quiet moment between pushes. The whole system has loosened its grip. 5 points off the bottom number deserves its own small pause, because the bottom number is the sneaky one. It is the pressure your arteries live under all the time, every second, even in your sleep, even now as you lie there listening to me. It is the baseline tension of the plumbing, and that constant background pressure is the one that grinds slowly at the vessel walls year after year, the steady drip that wears the stone. To bring that down 5 points is to lower the water level in the whole reservoir, not just to soften the biggest waves. So I have a man, imaginary but honestly built, who spent 14 minutes a week leaning on a wall, and who came out the far side of 12 weeks with a heart that has to push against less, and vessels that squeeze themselves less, and a nervous system that has quietly turned down its own volume. And he did not sweat. He did not run. He did not buy anything. He did not swallow anything. He simply made his muscles hold still and burn for 2 minutes at a time and let the plumbing draw its own conclusions. But now a suspicious thought ought to be nagging at you, the way it nags at me. All right, he did 14 minutes a week. Grant that. 14 minutes out of the 10,080 minutes there are in a week. He held the wall on Monday afternoon, and then what? He went about his business for 2 days until the next hold. And in between those little sessions, most of him is not leaning on any wall at all. Most of his week is ordinary. So is the benefit only there in those handful of minutes while he strains, a brief good deed quickly forgotten. Does the artery go soft for 2 minutes and then snap right back to its old tightness the moment he stands up and walks to the kitchen? If that were true, the whole thing would be a parlor trick. A number that dips while you watch and springs back the instant you look away. That would not lower anybody's risk of anything. Risk is not a thing that lives in a single afternoon. Risk is a thing that accumulates across all the hours, the sleeping ones and the waking ones, the ones you are paying attention to and the thousands you are not. So the real test, the honest test, is not what his pressure does during the hold. We already know it does something violent during the hold. It climbs, we watched it climb. The real test is what his pressure does afterward, in the long quiet hours after he has stopped, when he is not thinking about his heart at all. Does the wall reach forward into those hours? Does the good deed of the afternoon cast any shadow into the evening, into the night, into the next day? That is where we must go looking next, into the long tail of the thing, the hours after the effort ends, because that is where the protection either lives or dies. So let us follow him there. Let us follow the man on the wall out of the afternoon and into the rest of his day, and let us watch what his blood pressure does when he has entirely forgotten about it. He finishes his 4 holes. He shakes out his legs, which are trembling a little, the way legs do after they have been asked to hold up a chair that is not there. He has a cup of tea. He reads something. He does the ordinary business of an ordinary evening. And here is the thing the researchers found, the thing that turns this whole story from a curiosity into something close to a small miracle. His pressure does not merely return to where it started. It goes lower. It settles below the line it was sitting at before he ever leaned against the wall, and it stays there. Not for a minute. Not for an hour. It stays lowered for something on the order of 22 hours. Nearly a full turn of the clock. The effort was measured in minutes, and the reward is measured in the better part of a day. Think about the arithmetic of that for a moment. Gently, the way you would turn a smooth stone over in your hand. The work cost him a handful of minutes. The benefit spread itself across almost the entire span between one bedtime and the next. If he holds the wall in the late afternoon, then through dinner, through the washing up, through the quiet part of the night when the body does its repairs, through his sleep, through the gray light of the next morning, through his breakfast, his arteries are sitting at a kinder pressure than they otherwise would have. He is not doing anything. He is not thinking about it. He is, as far as he knows, simply living. And underneath, without any further instruction from him, the pressure stays down. The good deed of the afternoon really does reach forward into the night. The shadow is a long one. Now, why should that be? Why should a few minutes of holding still buy nearly a day of lowered pressure? The body is not sentimental. It does not give discounts for effort out of kindness. There has to be a mechanism, some lever that gets pushed during the hold and then stays pushed for hours afterward. And when the physiologists went looking, they found not one lever, but a small committee of them, all pulling in the same direction. The first is a chemical one. There is a substance your body uses to keep the vessels tight and the pressure up, a messenger of the alert and ready system, and its name is noradrenaline. After the isometric effort, the level of that messenger in the blood falls. Less of the tightening signal circulating means the vessels can afford to stay a little slacker, a little wider, and wider vessels mean lower pressure, the same way a wider pipe carries the same water at gentler pressure than a narrow one. The second lever is nervous rather than chemical, though the two are cousins. There is a set of nerves that runs out from the spine to the walls of the blood vessels, and their standing instruction most of the time is squeeze. Keep the tone up. Keep the walls firm. That outflow of squeeze signal is what physiologists call sympathetic outflow, and after the hold it is quieted. Inhibited is the word they use. The nerves that would ordinarily be murmuring squeeze, squeeze, squeeze to the vessel walls go softer for a while, and in that softness the walls relax. And the third lever is the plainest of all. The vessels are simply, physically held open. The dilation, the widening that came flooding in when you release the hold does not slam shut the moment the blood finishes rushing back. It lingers. Sustained vasodilation, they call it, sustained widening, and a widened vessel is a low-pressure vessel by the same plumbing logic as before. So you have three things at once. Less of the tightening chemical in the blood, less of the tightening signal down the nerves, and the vessels themselves propped a little more open. All three lean the same way, all three lean toward lower pressure, and none of them is in a hurry to reverse. That is why the effect does not evaporate when the sweat, if there were any, would have dried. There is barely any sweat to dry. That is the strange part. He did not run anywhere. He did not raise his heart rate into the pounding zone for half an hour. He leaned on a wall and held a chair that was not there, and the wall paid him back in a currency that lasts nearly a day. I want you to sit with the oddness of that, because it runs against something we all feel in our bones about exercise. We have absorbed, all of us, the notion that the reward is proportional to the misery, that you must be soaked, spent, gasping, that virtue is measured in how badly you want it to stop. And here is this quiet, almost embarrassingly undramatic thing, a man standing motionless against a wall, producing a longer, deeper lowering of pressure than the man who went out and ran until his lungs burned. The universe, it turns out, did not read the same motivational posters we did. It does not hand out its rewards according to how theatrical the effort looks. It hands them out according to what actually gets asked of the tissue, And what gets asked during a still, sustained, blood-choking hold is apparently exactly the sort of question the vascular system answers with lasting change. Let me make one more comparison, because the researchers were careful enough to make it for us, and it sharpens the point beautifully. They did not only look at the wall squat, they put it up against its cousins, the other ways you can hold a muscle still under load. You can squeeze a hand grip, a spring in your fist, and hold that. You can sit in a chair and hold your leg out straight against the resistance, a leg extension held in place. These are isometric too. They too involve a muscle contracting and staying contracted without moving, so you might expect them all to pay out about the same. But they do not. When you measure the drop in pressure 10 minutes after the hold is released, the wall squat wins, and it wins clearly, over both the hand grip and the held leg extension at matched intensities. It produces the largest fall in both the top number and the bottom number of the pressure reading. And why should the wall squat, of all the still exercises, be the champion of the champions? The answer is almost childishly simple, and I love it for that. It is about how much muscle you put to work at once. A hand grip asks a small handful of muscles in your forearm to do the holding. The wall squat asks the great engines of the lower body all together. The big muscles on the front of your thighs, the ones across your seat, the ones running down the back of your legs. It is the largest muscle mass you can conveniently recruit in a single still hold. And more muscle held under occlusion means more vessels squeezed shut during the hold, which means a bigger flood when you release, which means more of that wall-scouring shear stress, which means a bigger signal for the whole downstream cascade of relaxation. Bigger engine, bigger flood, bigger reward. The size of the muscle you recruit is, in the end, the size of the message you send to your arteries. So now the picture is filling in. We started with a man leaning on a wall and a pressure reading that climbed alarmingly during the hold, and for a moment it looked as though we might have caught the wall doing harm. But we followed the story past the hold, into the release, into the flood, and now into the long, quiet hours afterward, and we find that the alarming climb was only the front edge of the thing. The real gift comes later, and it comes long, and it comes from having asked a great deal of muscle to stay still and thirsty for a little while. The hold is the price. The 22 hours are the purchase. And a man who leans on that wall 3 times in a week is a man whose arteries spend a remarkable fraction of their entire week sitting at a gentler, safer pressure than they otherwise would, without his ever once having to think about it between the holes. That is the acute story. The story of a single session and its long shadow. But it raises a deeper question, and it is the question that everything so far has been quietly walking toward. If one session reaches 22 hours into the future, what happens when the sessions start to stack? What happens when you do this not once, but week upon week upon week, so that the shadow of one hold has not fully lifted before the next one is cast? Does the body simply keep resetting to the same baseline, collecting these day-long discounts one at a time? Or does something more permanent begin to happen? Some slow retuning of the machinery itself, so that the low pressure stops being a temporary guest and moves in for good. That is a different kind of change. A change not in the moment, but in the set point. And to understand it, we have to go and find the small, patient sensor buried in the wall of your arteries that decides, minute by minute, what your pressure is even allowed to be. So let us go find that sensor, because it is one of the most elegant little devices in the whole body, and almost nobody has ever heard of it. Run your fingers along the sides of your neck, just under the jaw, where you can feel your pulse. Right there, tucked into the wall of the big artery that carries blood up to your brain, there is a small patch of tissue where the artery bulges out ever so slightly. And in that bulge, woven right into the wall itself, are the endings of nerves that do only one thing. They feel stretch. That is all they do. They are not chemists. They do not taste anything. They do not count molecules. They are stretch detectors, little strain gauges sitting in the rubber of the pipe, reporting how hard the pipe is being pushed from the inside. We call this patch the baroreceptor, which is a fancy word that just means pressure catcher. And the way it works is beautifully simple. When your blood pressure rises, the artery wall gets stretched a little tighter, like the skin of a drum pulled taut. The nerve endings buried in that wall feel the extra stretch, and they start firing faster, sending a stream of little electrical pulses up to the base of your brain. When your pressure falls, the wall goes slack, the stretching eases, and the firing slows down. So the brain has, at every instant, a running measurement of the pressure in your arteries, told to it not by a number, but by the rhythm of a nerve. And here is what the brain does with that message. It runs a thermostat, not for temperature, but for pressure. When the baroreceptors report that pressure is climbing too high, the brain answers by easing off the sympathetic outflow, that constant nervous drumbeat we met earlier, the one that keeps your vessels squeezed a little tight. Ease off the drumbeat, the vessels relax, they widen, and the pressure comes back down. When the baroreceptors report pressure falling too low, the brain does the opposite. It leans on the drum a little harder, the vessels tighten, the heart quickens, and pressure climbs back up. Push and answer, second after second, all day and all night, whether you are running or sleeping or standing up too fast from a chair. That last one you have felt yourself. The little swimming moment when you rise too quickly and the world goes gray at the edges. That gray moment is your baroreceptor system catching a sudden drop and scrambling to fix it before you fall over. Usually it wins in a heartbeat or two. Now here is the thing that matters for our whole story, and it is subtle, so let me set it down gently. The thermostat does not have a fixed target. It has a set point, yes, a pressure it is trying to defend, the way a thermostat on the wall defends 70 degrees. But that set point can drift. It can be nudged. And in a great many people, as the years pile up, the set point drifts upward. The brain slowly comes to accept a higher and higher pressure as the new normal, the number it will fight to defend. It stops treating the high pressure as an alarm and starts treating it as the correct answer. This is one of the quiet tragedies of how high blood pressure becomes permanent. It is not just that the pipes get stiff. It is that the guardian in charge of the pressure has been talked into believing the danger is safety. Why does the set point drift? Part of it is the stiffening of the arteries themselves. Remember, the baroreceptor feels stretch. If the artery wall grows tough and leathery with age, then the same pressure produces less stretch than it used to. The strain gauge has gone dull. A pressure that would once have set the nerve firing like mad now produces only a lazy trickle of signal. So the brain, hearing only a trickle, concludes that pressure must be fine, and it does not push back. The sensor has lost its sensitivity, and a sensor that has lost its sensitivity is a sensor that lies by omission. It fails to raise the alarm not because there is no fire, but because its smoke detector battery has gone weak. And this, at last, is where the wall sit walks back onto the stage, not as an exerciser of muscles, but as a repairer of senses. Because that number I set down earlier, the one I asked you to hold on to, is about to pay off. In the 2024 review in Sports Medicine, when they looked at what isometric training does to this very system, they found something startling. In men who trained, the sensitivity of the baroreceptor did not improve by a little. It improved by a factor of 16. 16-fold. The strain gauge that had gone dull was in effect wiped clean and recalibrated, made keen again, made honest again. In women, the effect was smaller but still real, an improvement of about 3 6/10-fold. But 16-fold, in the men, that is not a tune-up. That is a rebuilt instrument. Sit with what that means, because it is the deepest part of the whole argument. When we lower blood pressure with a pill, most of the common pills work downstream. They relax the vessel, or they slow the heart, or they coax the kidney into shedding a little more salt and water. Good and useful things. All of them. But they do not, by and large, go back to the guardian and restore its eyesight. They manage the number while the sensor stays blind. What the isometric hold appears to do is something more fundamental. It reaches back to the thermostat itself and sharpens it, so that the brain can once again feel high pressure is high, and answer it as it was always meant to. You are not just turning the pressure down. You are teaching the body to want it down, and to notice and to defend the lower number on its own, without you, without a prescription, in the small hours when no one is watching. How could a stillness do that, when running and sweating and gasping do it so much less? We do not have the whole answer, and I will not pretend we do. But the shape of an answer is beginning to show itself, and it has to do with the peculiar violence of the hold. Think back to what happens inside the muscle during those 90 seconds. The pressure inside your arteries climbs to numbers that would frighten you if you saw them on a machine, up past 160, up toward 190 at the peak. That surge is not a side effect to be endured. It may be the very stimulus that matters. Because that big pulse of pressure, arriving over and over across weeks of training, is a repeated hard tug on the baroreceptor, a demand that it wake up and feel again. It is a kind of physical therapy for the strain gauge, a deliberate stretching of the sensor to remind it what stretch means. The steadier, gentler pressures of a jog may simply never grab the sensor hard enough to force it to recalibrate. There is a lovely irony hiding in that. The exercise that spikes your pressure the highest in the moment may be the one that lowers it the most over a lifetime. The brief danger is the teacher. The hold that looks the most alarming on the monitor is the one quietly doing the most repair. It is a little like the way a bone, stressed and loaded, comes back thicker and stronger, while a bone that is coddled and rested grows thin and brittle. The body does not strengthen against comfort. It strengthens against the right kind of challenge, delivered again and again with rest in between. And the wall sit, it turns out, is a nearly perfect delivery system for exactly that challenge, aimed at exactly the organ that needs it. Now I want to be honest and careful here, the way we must always be careful when a story starts to sound too tidy. That 16-fold figure is a striking one, and striking figures deserve suspicion until they have been seen many times, in many hands, in many rooms. It comes from a particular body of work, and the gap between men and women in that result, the 16 against the 3 6/10, is itself a signal that we do not yet fully understand the machinery. Maybe it is about hormones. Maybe it is about muscle mass and the size of the pressure surge. Maybe it is about something no one has thought of yet. When a difference that large sits unexplained in the middle of your data, the honest scientist does not paper over it. He circles it, he points at it, and he says, there, that is where the next question lives. So I will not tell you that we have this locked down. I will tell you that the direction of the arrow is clear and the size of it is large enough to make you lean forward, and the mechanism is at least plausible, and that is a very interesting place for a piece of science to be. But step back from the numbers for a moment and feel the shape of what we have built. We started this whole long evening with a lab slip and a single number printed on it, the cholesterol number, and we watched that numbers authority slowly come apart in our hands. Then we went looking for what might be more honest, and we found fitness and strength and the pressure in the pipes. And now we have followed the pressure all the way down to a small patch of nerve endings in the wall of an artery in your neck, a guardian that can go blind with age and can, astonishingly, be given its sight back by the simple act of leaning against a wall and refusing to stand up for 90 seconds. The lab slip measures a substance floating in your blood. The wall sit measures, and then improves, the living regulation of the whole system. One is a photograph of a molecule, the other is a test of the machinery and a repair of it in the same motion. And that raises the question we have not yet dared to ask directly, the one that has been standing quietly at the edge of the room this whole time. If holding the wall trains the guardian, and trains the vessels, and trains the muscle all at once, then how long does it actually take before a person, a real person, an ordinary tired person with a high number and a worried doctor, can measure the difference in their own body? Not in a rabbit, not in an average across 15,000 strangers, but in themselves. For that, we have to leave the world of mechanism behind and walk into a very particular room, where 77 people with stubbornly high blood pressure agreed to lean against the wall 3 times a week and let the scientists watch what happened to them over the course of 12 weeks. So picture this room. It is not dramatic. There is no gleaming machine, no whirring centrifuge, no rabbit in a cage. There is a wall, an ordinary wall, and there are people leaning against it with their knees bent as if they are sitting in a chair that isn't there. 77 of them, spread across more than one center so the result wouldn't just be a fluke of one clinic or one town. Their average age was about 45 years. 2 out of every 3 were men. And every single one of them carried the same quiet problem in their arteries. Their blood pressure was too high, and none of them were taking medicine to bring it down. They were, in a sense, exactly the kind of person who walks out of a doctor's office with a worried look and a lab slip and no idea what to actually do about it. Now the scientist gave half of them a very particular instruction. Lean against the wall until your knees are bent to about 95 degrees, a little past the right angle, so the big muscles of the thigh have to work hard to hold you there. Hold that for 2 minutes. Then stand up, rest for 2 minutes, and do it again. 4 holds in all. And do this little ritual 3 times a week. That's the whole prescription. Nothing else. No running, no weights, no special diet forced on them, just the wall, 4 times, twice as long as a good song, 3 days out of 7. The other half, the controls, went on living exactly as they had been. They are the comparison, the flat line against which we measure whether anything happened at all, because you always need the group that did nothing. Without them, you're just telling yourself a story. With them, you can see whether the wall did something the ordinary passage of time would not have done on its own. 12 weeks later, they measured everyone again. 12 weeks. That's about 3 months. 1 season. Autumn into winter or winter into spring. And here is what they found, and I want you to sit with the size of it, because the number is not small. The people who leaned against the wall had dropped their top blood pressure number, the systolic, the pressure at the peak of each heartbeat, by nearly 13 points. 12.9 millimeters of mercury, to say it exactly. And the group that did nothing, they dropped by 0.4 of 1 point, which is to say they didn't move at all. That 0.4 is just noise, the little wobble you'd get from measuring the same still pond twice. Think about what that gap means. 2 groups of people, the same age, the same problem, the same starting line. One group leaned on a wall for a few minutes a week, the other didn't, and 3 months later there was a canyon of almost 13 points of pressure between them, opened up out of nothing but the geometry of a bent knee and a little patience. When they looked specifically at the wall squat in a broader review the next year, gathering the studies together, the drop came out around 11.5 points on top and about 5 points on the bottom number. The diastolic, the resting pressure between beats. Slightly different arithmetic, same unmistakable direction. The wall works. And now I want to do a piece of accounting that I find almost funny, it's so lopsided. Let's add up how much actual work these people did. 4 holes, 2 minutes each. That's 8 minutes of the muscle straining per session. 3 sessions a week. 8 times 3 is 24, but the standard protocol across the trials, once you fold in the slight variations, comes out to something like 14 minutes of genuine isometric effort in a whole week. 14 minutes. Out of 10,080 minutes in a week. You could not fill a single episode of a television program with the total amount of straining these people did to move their blood pressure by more than the number a doctor gets excited about. Most shows you'd sit through are longer than the entire week's worth of exercise that did this. I keep turning that over because it offends something in us, doesn't it? We have been taught that the reward must match the suffering, that to fix the heart you must pound the pavement, drench your shirt, gasp for air, pay in sweat and time and misery. And here is this still, silent, almost lazy-looking thing, a person leaning on a wall doing apparently nothing, quietly outperforming the runner and the interval sprinter on the one number that batters the artery wall. Nature does not charge by the sweat. She charges by the right stimulus. And the right stimulus, it turns out, can be very quiet. But I've been telling you about 12 weeks, about the slow accumulation, the training effect, the guardian being retrained over a season, and that might leave you with the impression that nothing happens until you've put in your 3 months, that the benefit is a distant reward you have to earn with patience. So let me correct that, because there's a second gift hiding inside a single session, and it's one of the strangest and gentlest facts in this whole story. When you finish one wall sit, just one, and you stand up and shake out your legs and go on with your day, your blood pressure doesn't just settle back to where it started. It goes lower, lower than your normal resting level, and it stays down there. Not for a minute, not for an hour, for up to 22 hours. Nearly a full day and night. Let that sink in slowly the way it deserves. You lean on a wall in the morning. And that evening, while you're eating dinner, your pressure is still running below its usual mark. You go to sleep, and through the small hours while you dream, the shield is still up. You wake, and it's only just beginning to fade. One little session of doing almost nothing casts a shadow of protection across almost the entire day that follows. Why? What holds the pressure down for all those hours after the muscle has stopped working? It comes down to three quiet things happening at once. First, the level of noradrenaline in the blood drops. Noradrenaline is one of the body's main push harder signals, the chemical whip that tightens vessels and drives the pressure up. Turn it down, and the vessels loosen. Second, the sympathetic outflow itself, the steady stream of nerve traffic from the brain telling the arteries to stay tense, gets inhibited. The foot comes off the accelerator. And third, the vessels themselves stay dilated, held open, relaxed, for hour after the flood of blood on release did its work on their inner walls. Three mechanisms, all pointing the same way, all leaning on the pressure to keep it down long after you've forgotten you ever did the exercise. And of all the ways you might hold still and strain a muscle, the wall squat does this the strongest. Somebody thought to compare them directly. They took the wall squat and set it against the hand grip, where you squeeze a device in your fist, and against the leg extension, where you push out with one set of muscles, all at matched intensities, and they watch the blood pressure 10 minutes after each. The wall squat produced the biggest drop of the three, both on the top number and the bottom, and the reason is almost childishly simple once you see it. The wall squat recruits the most muscle. It doesn't just work a fist or a single band of the thigh, it calls in the quadriceps across the front of your legs, and the glutes, the big muscles you sit on, and the hamstrings behind. It is the largest bonfire of muscle you can light while standing perfectly still. And the bigger the fire, the bigger the reactive flood when you release it, and the bigger the flood, the harder the shear on the vessel walls, and the harder that shear, the more of that relaxing molecule gets released to hold everything open through the night. So there it is, the shape of the whole thing coming into view. A single hold buys you nearly a day of lowered pressure. String those days together, 3 a week for 12 weeks, and the temporary shield hardens into a permanent recalibration, the guardian reset, the resting pressure moved down and made to stay there. The acute gift and the chronic gift are the same mechanism, just measured over 2 different stretches of time. One is what happens by dinner, the other is what happens by spring. And now, having watched what a wall can do to the pressure, I want to widen the lens one more time, because pressure is only one of the numbers this quiet exercise is quietly moving. Remember, we came into this whole investigation chasing the idea that what your muscles can do tells you more about how long you'll live than what floats in your blood. We've now seen the pressure fall, but there was another thread, one I set down a while ago and promised we'd return to. It concerns not the pressure in the pipes, but the raw strength of the body doing the holding. And for that, we have to go and find 8,762 men who were followed patiently for the better part of 2 decades to answer a single stubborn question: does being strong, just plain strong, keep you alive even after you've accounted for everything else we thought mattered? So picture the setup. You gather these men, and you do not just weigh them or take their blood. You measure how strong they are. You have them push and grip and lift, and you write down what their muscles can actually produce. And then you do the patient, unglamorous thing. You wait. Not a week, not a season. You wait, on average, 18.9 years. That is nearly 2 decades of ordinary life. Men going to work, raising children, arguing about the weather, growing older the way we all do. And over those years, 503 of them died. That is the sad arithmetic that makes this kind of study mean something. Death is the one measurement nobody can fake, nobody can talk their way out of, nobody can improve with a clever diet the week before the appointment. Now, what did the arithmetic say? The men were sorted into 3 groups by their raw muscular strength. The weakest third at the bottom, the middling third in the middle, and the strongest third at the top. And when you compared the top against the bottom, the strong men against the weak men, the strong ones were dying at a rate that was roughly 3/4 of the weak ones. Put a number on it: their hazard, their running risk of dying from any cause at all sat somewhere between 0.72 and 0.77 of the weak group's risk. And for dying specifically of the heart and the vessels, of cardiovascular trouble, the number was 0.71. In plainer speech, being in the strong third came with something like a quarter to a third less risk of dying over those years than being in the weak third. Just from strength, just from what the muscles could do. Here is where I want you to slow down and catch the thing that is easy to walk past. Because a skeptic, and I do like a good skeptic, would jump up right here and say, but of course the strong men live longer. Strong men are probably fitter men. They probably run around more, their hearts and lungs are probably in better shape, and it is really that heart and lung fitness doing the saving, and strength is just riding along beside it, taking credit it did not earn. That is a fair objection. That is exactly the kind of objection that separates a real finding from a coincidence. And the people who ran this study were not fools. They had heard that objection coming from a mile off. So they did the statistical equivalent of subtracting it out. They took the cardiorespiratory fitness, the heart and lung capacity, and they held it constant. Mathematically, they said, let us pretend all these men had the very same aerobic fitness, and now, with that removed from the picture, does strength still matter? And it did. They did the same trick with body weight, with the body mass index, the tallness against heaviness ratio we all get measured by. Held it constant. Strength still mattered. They held smoking constant, because of course smokers die sooner and maybe strong men just smoked less. Strength still mattered. And then, and this is the one that matters most for our whole long evening together, they held the cholesterol constant. They accounted for the men with high cholesterol in the blood. The very number that has sat on the throne of heart medicine for 70 years. They subtracted its influence out of the equation. And when the dust settled and every one of those objections had been answered, the strength was still standing there, still lowering the risk of death, still refusing to be explained away. Sit with that a moment, because it is a strange and quiet kind of victory. We have a number, cholesterol, that gets measured at nearly every checkup, that gets lectured about, that launches whole industries of pills and diets. And we have another number, plain muscular strength, that mostly gets ignored by the doctor entirely, that nobody writes on the lab slip, that gets treated as a matter for gymnasiums and vanity. And when you put the two of them in the same room and ask which one is telling you more about whether this man will be alive in 20 years, the ignored one keeps its feet while the famous one has to step aside. The strength is not merely a passenger on the fitness bus. It is carrying its own cargo. It is saying something about you that the blood cannot say. And what is it saying? That is the beautiful question, and I do not think we can answer it completely, so I will not pretend to. But we can reason our way toward the edge of it. A muscle that is strong is a muscle that has been used. It is tissue that has demanded a good blood supply and been given one, tissue laced with capillaries, rich in the little machinery that burns fuel cleanly. Strength is not just a number about your arms. It is a fossil record written into your body of how you have lived and moved for years. You cannot cram for it. You cannot swallow a pill on Tuesday and be strong by Wednesday. The strength in a man's grip is the honest, slow accumulation of thousands of ordinary efforts, and that is precisely why it predicts so well. It is not a snapshot of one morning's blood chemistry which can swing with a single greasy breakfast. It is a summary of the whole way the machine has been run. Now I told you we would keep circling back to one idea, and here it comes around again, a little richer each time. What can your muscles do? We keep asking it, and the answer keeps opening wider. Early on, it was a question about a wall and a 90-second hold. Then it became a question about pressure falling in the arteries. Now it has become a question about the raw force the body can produce, and that force turns out to be whispering a secret about mortality itself, a secret that outlasts and outpredicts the blood test. The muscles, it seems, are not merely the engine of the body. They are one of its most honest witnesses. And notice how differently these two witnesses testify. The cholesterol is a stranger's report. Somebody draws your blood, sends it away to a machine in another building, and a number comes back on a slip of paper, and you are asked to trust that the number is your fate. You never felt it. You never did anything to earn it or to know it. It is handed to you. But the strength and the endurance in that wall sit. These you feel. These you find out about with your own body in your own kitchen against your own wall. Nobody hands you the 90 seconds. You either have them in your legs or you do not, and the finding out is the doing. There is an honesty in that which the laboratory can never quite match. The lab gives you a verdict about yourself from the outside. The wall lets you interrogate yourself from the inside. I do not want to overstate it and turn a good finding into a religion. The cholesterol is not nothing. The blood chemistry matters. Nobody serious is telling you to throw the whole edifice of lipid science in the fire, and I am certainly not. What we are doing all evening is more careful than that. We are asking about weight, about emphasis, about which numbers we have been staring at while other, quieter numbers, sitting right there in plain view, were carrying more of the truth than we credited them with. For 70 years the loud number got the attention, because it was easy to measure, easy to put in a guideline, easy to turn into a threshold. And the quiet numbers, the ones about what your body can actually do, sat in the corner being underestimated, because they were harder to bottle and sell. So we now have two witnesses against the old story, standing shoulder to shoulder. On one side, the treadmill men, 6,213 of them, telling us that aerobic capacity out predicts the traditional risk factors, cholesterol included. On the other side, these 8,762 strong and weak men telling us that muscular strength does the very same thing, and does it even after you subtract the aerobic fitness away. So it is not just a copy of the first witness, it is a second independent voice saying the same unsettling thing. When two different measurements, made by two different research groups, on two different populations, using two different definitions of what the body can do, both arrive at the same doorstep and knock, you begin to suspect that there is really somebody home. That the pattern is not an accident. That the body's capacity, its power, and its endurance is genuinely one of the deepest readouts of health we possess. And so the ground under the old comfortable consensus, the one we built up so lovingly in the first part of our evening, has now shifted in two places at once. We have watched the pressure fall under the wall. We have watched strength defy the statisticians and keep on predicting who lives. What remains, and what we will turn to next, is to ask what all of this is really made of, down at the level of the vessel wall itself, where the blood meets the pipe, and where a single square of tissue thinner than you can imagine turns out to be running the whole show. So let us go there. Let us shrink ourselves down, the way you would in a dream, until we are small enough to ride along inside one of your own arteries, and let us look at the wall from the inside. Most people, when they picture a blood vessel, picture a rubber hose, a dumb pipe, something that just sits there and lets the red stuff go by. And for a long time, that is more or less how the doctors pictured it too. The vessel was plumbing, and cholesterol was the grease that clogged the plumbing, and that was the whole story. But the vessel is not a dumb pipe. Lining the inside of every artery you own, from the big ones near your heart down to the tiniest little threads out in your fingertips, there is a single layer of cells. One cell thick. You could not see it without a good microscope. If you took that lining out of a grown adult and spread it flat, it would cover something like a tennis court, and yet stacked up it would weigh about as much as your heart. This lining has a name. We call it the endothelium. And it is not passive. It is the busiest, chattiest, most opinionated organ in your whole body that nobody ever talks about. Here is what this thin sheet is doing every second of your life. It is feeling the blood. Not chemically, not by tasting it, but by feeling the drag of it, the way you feel wind on the back of your hand when you stick it out of a moving car. The blood slides past these cells, and the sliding tugs on them, and that tug has a name too. We call it shear stress. It is just friction, really, the friction of a fluid moving along a surface. And the remarkable thing, the thing that took people the better part of the 20th century to fully believe, is that these little cells can measure that friction. They have tiny structures on their surface, little hairs and channels and folds that bend when the blood tugs harder. And when they bend, the cell does something extraordinary. It manufactures a gas. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it sounds like something I made up to keep you awake. A cell in the wall of your artery feeling the blood rush by, responds to that rushing by cooking up a gas, right there on the spot, out of raw materials floating around inside it. The gas is nitric oxide, just one atom of nitrogen married to one atom of oxygen, about the simplest little molecule you could ask for. And this gas does not stay put. It cannot stay put. It is so small and so restless that it seeps straight out of the endothelial cell and sinks down into the muscle wrapped around the vessel, the smooth muscle that squeezes the pipe tighter or lets it relax. And when the nitric oxide arrives, it whispers to that muscle, "Let go. Loosen up. Open." And the muscle obeys. The vessel widens. More blood flows. The pressure eases. Now, why does this matter for a man doing a wall sit? Because the wall sit, that quiet, unglamorous, sweat-free little agony against the wall, is one of the most powerful ways ever measured to give this system a workout. And to see why, we have to watch the whole thing unfold in 3 acts, because it really does come in 3 distinct steps, and each one is beautiful in its own right. The first act happens during the hold. You are down there, thighs parallel to the floor, knees bent at about 90 degrees, back flat against the wall, and your big leg muscles are locked in a fierce, unmoving contraction. Nothing is moving. From the outside, you look almost peaceful, like a person patiently waiting for a bus that will never come. But inside those muscles, something is being pinched shut. When a muscle contracts hard and holds, it squeezes down on its own blood vessels. It clamps its own supply lines. The blood that wants to flow through the working muscle gets partly cut off, partly occluded, and the muscle starts to run its errands without fresh deliveries. Waste products build up. The oxygen dwindles. And buried in the muscle tissue there are nerve endings, little sensors that notice all of this. We divide them into 2 families. One family, which we call the group 3 fibers, feels the mechanical part, the squeezing and the tension. The other family, the group 4 fibers, taste the chemistry, the acid and the metabolites piling up because the blood cannot get through to wash them away. And both families start shouting up the nerves toward the brain and the spinal cord saying, "Something strenuous is happening down here, send help." That shouting has a consequence. The nervous system answers by cranking up what we call sympathetic outflow, the body's accelerator pedal. The heart pumps harder, the vessels elsewhere tighten, and the blood pressure, which for a healthy young person sitting quietly might read something like 121/77, begins to climb, and climb steeply. In studies of young adults holding this position, the pressure rose on average to about 164/104. And in some individuals at the peak, it reached as high as 189/123. Those are big numbers. Those are, in the moment, frankly alarming numbers, if you did not know what you were looking at. During the hold, the wall sit is not lowering your blood pressure at all. It is doing the opposite. It is driving it up like a rocket. And this is exactly the place where people get confused, so let me linger here, because it is the crux of the whole thing. The benefit of the wall sit is not in the hold. The hold is the provocation. The hold is you deliberately poking the system, stressing it, backing it into a corner. The magic comes in the second act. And the second act begins the instant you stand up and let go. When you release, all those clamp-shut vessels in your legs spring open at once. And the blood, which has been dammed up and held back and rerouted, comes flooding in. We have a name for this flood. We call it reactive hyperemia, which is just a fancy way of saying the reactive oversupply of blood. The muscle was starved, and now the body overcorrects and pours in far more blood than usual to make up the debt. And that flood roars through the vessels at a tremendous rate. And what does a fast flood of blood do to that thin lining we met a few minutes ago, the endothelium? It drags on it hard. It cranks up the shear stress to a very high level all along the inner wall all at once. And the endothelial cells feel that enormous tug, and they do the only thing they know how to do when the blood pulls at them like that. They pour out nitric oxide, a great gush of it. The whole vascular bed of the leg and beyond gets bathed in the gas that tells muscle to relax and vessels to open. The pipes dilate. The pressure sinks. and it stays sunk for a while because you have flooded the system with the very signal that keeps it open. So the picture, if you step back and look at it whole, is almost mischievous in its cleverness. You squeeze to starve. You release the flood. You flood to shear. You shear to make the gas. And the gas is what heals you. The stress was never the enemy. The stress was the trigger for the medicine, and the medicine is manufactured free of charge by a layer of cells 1 cell thick, using nothing but the physics of moving fluid. You did not swallow a thing. You did not buy anything at the pharmacy. You leaned against the wall for a couple of minutes and let your own arterial lining write you a prescription. Now, if that were all, it would already be a lovely story, but it would only explain the good feeling of an afternoon. It would explain why your pressure dips for a few hours after a session. It would not yet explain the truly astonishing part, the part that made those 270 trials sit up and take notice, which is that people who do this over and over, week after week, do not just get a temporary dip. They walk around all day, every day, even when they are nowhere near a wall, with a permanently lower resting blood pressure. Something has changed and stayed changed. And for that we need the third act, the slow one, the one that unfolds not over seconds or hours, but over weeks. And it is the deepest and strangest of the three, because in the third act the body does not merely open a valve or release a gas. In the third act, the body quietly reaches up into its own control room, finds the dial that sets the baseline, the resting level, the number your pressure returns to when everything is calm, and it turns that dial down and it leaves it there. How a couple of minutes of leaning against a wall repeated a few times a week can talk its way into the deepest thermostat of the cardiovascular system and reset it is where we are headed next. So let me take you into that control room, because it is a real place, or at least a real system, and it is one of the loveliest pieces of engineering your body ever came up with. Tucked into the walls of two of your biggest arteries, right up in the neck where the blood rushes toward the brain, and in the great arch of the aorta just above the heart, there are little patches of nerve endings that do nothing all day long but feel the stretch of the vessel wall. That is their whole job. They are strain gauges. When your blood pressure rises, the artery wall stretches a little more, and these nerve endings fire a little faster. When your pressure falls, the wall relaxes, the stretch eases, and they quiet down. We call them baroreceptors, which is just a fancy way of saying pressure feelers, and they are chattering away to your brainstem every single second of your life, sending up a running report on how hard the blood is pushing. Now the brainstem listens to this report and it does something with it. If the pressure climbs too high, the brain tells the heart to ease off and tells the vessels to loosen. If the pressure sags too low, the brain speeds the heart and tightens the vessels to bring it back up. It is a thermostat in the truest sense. You set a house thermostat to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and the furnace clicks on when the room drops below, clicks off when it climbs above. The baroreceptor loop does exactly that, except the thing it is holding steady is the pressure of your own blood, and the furnace and the air conditioner are your heart and your arteries. Here is the subtle part, the part that took physiologists a long time to really believe. That thermostat has a set point. There is a number the whole loop is defending, a pressure it treats as normal, as home, as the place to return to. And in a person with high blood pressure, the tragedy is not that the thermostat is broken. The thermostat works beautifully. The tragedy is that the set point has drifted upward. The whole system has quietly agreed that this new, higher pressure is the correct one, and it defends that wrong number just as fiercely and just as faithfully as a healthy system defends a good one. Give such a person a drug that lowers their pressure, and the baroreceptors notice the drop, decide something is wrong, and push right back to hold the pressure up toward the set point they are guarding. The thermostat is fighting you. It thinks it is helping. So the real question, the deep one, is not how do you push the pressure down for an afternoon. Anything can do that for an afternoon. The real question is, how do you convince the thermostat itself to accept the lower number as home? How do you walk into the control room and turn the dial, not just nudge the temperature while the dial stays put? And this is where the wall sit does something that genuinely surprised the people who measured it. When you hold that squat, and the pressure surges up to 164 over 104, and your baroreceptors are stretching and screaming their report to the brainstem, you are giving that whole loop a workout. You are exercising the pressure control system the same way you exercise a muscle. Over and over, week after week, you send the system a big, clean, dramatic swing in pressure. Up during the hold, down during the flood of release, up, down, up, down. And a control system that gets exercised like that becomes more sensitive. It gets better at hearing small changes. The nerve endings, the wiring, the whole reflex arc becomes quicker and finer. The way your ear becomes better at picking out one instrument in an orchestra, the more carefully you listen. The physiologists have a number for how much sharper this reflex becomes, and when I first saw it, I thought surely there is a misprint. In trained men, after a program of this kind of isometric work, the sensitivity of the baroreceptor reflex went up roughly 16-fold. 16 times more responsive. Not 16%, 16 times. In women, the effect was gentler, closer to 3.5 times, still a real and substantial change, but nothing like the enormous shift seen in the men. We do not fully understand why the sexes differ so much here, and I am not going to pretend we do. But even the smaller number is remarkable. You have taken a control system that had grown dull and lazy, defending a bad set point without complaint, and you have woken it up. And here is what a sharper baroreceptor reflex does for you. A sensitive thermostat does not tolerate drift. It catches the pressure creeping up and corrects it early, gently, before it becomes a habit. It keeps the vessels from settling into that permanently clenched, high-toned state. The brain, receiving a louder and clearer signal from below, no longer needs to keep the sympathetic nerves firing quite so hard. And that firing, that steady sympathetic drumbeat that keeps your small arteries squeezed a little tighter than they need to be, is the very thing that sets your resting pressure. Turn that drumbeat down, and the small vessels relax their grip, and the resting pressure, the number you carry around all day, comes down and stays down. The dial has moved. I want you to feel how different this is from the other two acts. In the first act, the hold, the pressure went up. That was mechanical. Immediate, over in seconds. In the second act, the release, the nitric oxide flooded out and the vessels opened for minutes, and the afterglow of that opening kept your pressure low for hours, up to nearly a full day. But both of those are events. They happen, they peak, they fade. The third act is not an event. The third act is a change in the machine itself. It is the difference between opening a window to cool a room and rebuilding the thermostat so the room simply runs cooler from now on. One is a gesture. The other is a renovation. And it explains something that would otherwise be a genuine puzzle. When those researchers gave people 12 weeks of wall squats, 3 sessions a week, and measured them at the end, they did not measure them mid-squat, red-faced and straining. They measured them at rest, on a quiet morning, sitting calmly in a chair, nowhere near a wall, no exertion in sight. And the resting pressure of the wall squat group had fallen by nearly 13 points of systolic pressure, while the people who did nothing barely moved at all. A change of less than half a point, statistical noise, the ordinary drift of a body left to its own devices. That 13-point gap is not the pressure during the exercise. It is the new home. It is the set point. Relocated. The dial turned down and left there. Think about what that quiet morning measurement really represents. Every one of those people spent, in total, something like 14 minutes a week doing the work. 14 minutes of leaning against a wall, spread across 3 sittings, less time than it takes to boil a pot of pasta and lay the table. And out of those 14 weekly minutes, stretched over 12 weeks, came a change in resting blood pressure large enough that if a pill delivered it, we would call that pill a serious and effective medicine. We do call such pills serious medicines. There are drugs prescribed to millions that lower pressure by less than this and are considered well worth taking, worth their cost, worth their side effects. Now I am not standing here telling anyone to throw away their medicine. That is not my trade, and it would be reckless of me to pretend it is. Some people need drugs, and thank goodness the drugs exist. But I want you to sit with the strangeness of the accounting. On one side of the ledger you have decades of research, industrial chemistry, Careful trials, real cost, real value, all aimed at nudging a thermostat downward from the outside. And on the other side, you have a person, a wall, and 14 minutes a week, reaching the same thermostat from the inside and turning the dial by hand. The body was carrying the tool the whole time. It only needed to be asked. There is one more thing about this reset I have to tell you, because it is the piece that ties the whole long story together, all the way back to that lab slip in the doctor's office where we started. When we measured cholesterol, we were measuring a substance, a thing floating in the blood, a number on a page, a still photograph of one ingredient in an enormously complicated soup. When we ask you to hold a wall sit and we watch what your body does, we are not measuring a substance at all. We are measuring a performance. We are watching the control system run. We are seeing in real time how sharp your reflexes are, how freely your vessels open, how quickly the flood comes when you release, how long your legs can feed themselves with oxygen under load. And a performance tells you something a substance never can. It tells you not what is in the machine, but how well the machine works. That distinction between the ingredient and the performance, between the photograph and the film, is the whole quiet argument of this talk, and we are not quite done drawing it out. Let me sit with that idea of the performance a little longer, because there is a piece of it that people miss, and it is the most beautiful piece. When you hold that wall sit, you are not testing one organ. You think you are testing your legs. Your legs are screaming, so naturally you think this is a leg contest. But your legs are only the stage. The real actors are hidden. Behind that burning quadriceps there is a whole committee of systems, all of them working at once, all of them being graded, and none of them able to fake it. Think about who shows up to that 90-second exam. First, the heart itself, which has to push harder because the muscle you are squeezing has clamped down on its own little blood vessels, and the pressure backs up like water behind a kinked garden hose. Second, the arteries, which have to stretch and take that surge without complaint, and a stiff old pipe cannot do that gracefully. Third, the tiny nerve endings buried in the muscle, the ones we talked about, the mechanical listeners and the chemical listeners, sending their reports up the spinal cord to the brain. Fourth, the brain stem itself, the quiet manager down at the base of your skull that reads the pressure and decides how much to open the throttle. And fifth, the small factory lining every vessel, the endothelium, waiting for the moment of release so it can pour out its little puff of gas and let everything relax. Every one of those has to do its job, in sequence, on time, under load. And you cannot bribe a single one of them. You cannot swallow a pill an hour before and make your baroreceptors sharper for the test. The performance is honest in a way a substance can never be, because the substance just sits there and lets you measure it, while the performance has to actually happen. Here is a thought that I find almost funny. Suppose you wanted to cheat the cholesterol test. It is not hard. You change what you eat for a few weeks, or you take a medicine and the number on the page moves. The number obeys. But suppose you wanted to cheat the wall sit. How would you do it? You would have to genuinely lower your resting pressure. You would have to genuinely make your vessels more supple. You would have to genuinely teach your brain stem to hold the line under stress, and genuinely build the little oxygen furnaces inside your leg muscle so they can keep burning past the minute mark. In other words, the only way to cheat the wall sit is to actually become healthier. The test cannot be gamed, because passing the test and being well are the same thing. I do not know of many measurements in medicine you can say that about. Most numbers you can move without moving the disease. This one, you cannot. And that leads me to a gentle warning, because I do not want you to walk away from this thinking I have handed you a magic trick. The 90-second mark I keep returning to is not a line drawn by nature in some laboratory. Nobody ran a great trial that watched thousands of people, timed their wall sits to the second, and then followed them for 20 years to see who lived. That study, as far as I know, has not been done. So when I tell you 90 seconds is elite for a person past 50 and above average for nearly everyone, I am telling you what the fitness charts say, not what a mortality curve proved. I want to be honest with you about the seam in the fabric. The strength of the argument is not that 90 seconds is a magic number. The strength is in everything underneath it. It is in the treadmill men, 6,213 of them, where every single rung you could climb in fitness brought you 12% more survival. It is in the strong men in that British study, 8,762 of them, where the strongest third carried a risk of dying nearly a third lower than the weakest third, and that held up even after the accountants subtracted out fitness, and weight, and smoking, and yes, cholesterol. The number 90 is a doorway. What matters is the room it opens into. So let me put the pieces on the table side by side, slowly, the way you would lay out tools before a job, because I think seeing them together is where the calm certainty comes from. On one side, you have a substance in the blood, measured while you sit perfectly still, that told us, in a study of more than 136,000 people who had just had a heart attack, that almost 3/4 of them had walked in with cholesterol numbers the guidelines called safe. On the other side, you have a performance, a thing your whole cardiovascular committee has to actually pull off, that predicts survival better than the traditional risk factors do, cholesterol included, by the words of the researchers themselves. I am not asking you to throw the blood test in the river. It still tells you something real about one ingredient. I am asking you to notice which of the two you would rather stake your life on if you could only look at one. There is something almost philosophical hiding in here, and since we have all night, let me pull on it. In physics, we have this old, deep distinction between the state of a thing and the behavior of a thing. You can tell me everything about where all the parts are, all the positions, all the amounts, a full inventory, and still not know what the system will do when you push it. A bridge can pass every inspection of its materials and still sway itself apart in a wind, because the danger was never in the steel, it was in how the whole thing responds. Cholesterol is a state measurement. It is an inventory. It tells you how much of a certain something is present. The wall sit is a behavior measurement. It asks the system to respond, and it grades the response. And nature, in my long experience of her, cares far more about how you respond than about what is sitting in your cupboards. She is not impressed by your inventory. She is impressed by your reflexes. Now let me anticipate a fair objection, because a good listener should be arguing back at me by now, half asleep or not. You might say, but surely the reason fit people live longer is just that they were healthier to begin with. Maybe the wall sit does not make you well, it just reveals who was already lucky. And that is a serious point. It is exactly the right thing to worry about, and it is why the training studies matter so much. Because in those, they did not just watch people, they intervened. They took unmedicated adults with high blood pressure, ordinary people, and they had them do nothing but that wall squat, 4 holds of 2 minutes, 3 times a week, and after 12 weeks, the pressure at the top of their cycle had fallen almost 13 points, while the people who did nothing barely moved at all. That is not selection. That is not luck being revealed. That is cause and effect produced on purpose in about 14 minutes of work a week. The performance is not only a mirror that shows you who you are, it is also a lever you can pull to change who you are. It reads you and it remakes you with the very same motion. And the remaking runs deeper than the number on the cuff, which is the part I find quietly astonishing. Remember what happens inside. Every time you hold and release, you send that flood of blood tearing through vessels that had been squeezed shut, and the rush of it drags along the inner walls, and that dragging is a signal. The lining feels the current and answers by making that little breath of gas that tells the walls to loosen. Do that over and over, week after week, and the whole system learns. The brainstem resets where it thinks normal pressure ought to be. In the trained men, the sensitivity of those pressure sensors climbed 16-fold. 16 times more alert than before. You are not just lowering a number. You are retuning the thermostat of the entire circulation, teaching an old reflex a new setting, and it will keep that setting even while you sleep, even while you do nothing, carrying the benefit of one honest effort forward for the better part of a day, up to 22 hours, a shield you earned in minutes and wear for hours without a thought. So we have followed this thing a long way now, from the gallstone on the French chemist's bench, through the patient rabbits and the great study by the lake at Framingham, into the doctor's office where the number on the slip became gospel, and out the other side where 136,000 heart attacks quietly told us the gospel had a hole in it. And we have arrived somewhere I did not want to rush you to, because arriving too fast would have cheated you of the reason. The reason is the whole point. It is not enough to be told that the still exercise beats the sweaty one, or that a performance beats a photograph. You have to see why, in the plumbing and the nerves and the little factory in the vessel wall, so that when you lower yourself against a wall tonight or tomorrow and your legs begin to complain, you will know exactly what is happening in there, and you will not be afraid of it. And you will not be fooled by anyone who tells you the only number that matters is the one they drew from your arm while you sat perfectly still. There is more to say yet about what this all means for how you might think of your own body, and I am not finished drawing the thread. So let me pull that thread now, gently, the way you pull a loose stitch in a sweater to see where it leads before you decide whether to cut it. We had those 136,000 hearts, and most of them, 7 out of every 10, walked into the hospital carrying a cholesterol number that a doctor would have patted on the head and called safe. That is the whole. But a hole in a story only matters if you have something better to put in its place. Otherwise, you are just complaining. And I do not want to leave you complaining. I want to leave you with something you can lean your whole weight against. So here is the something better, and it comes from a long, patient watching of men. Not a clever experiment in a single afternoon. A watching. There were 8,762 of them, and the people running the study did not do anything dramatic to these men. They measured how strong they were, and then they waited. They waited, on average, 18.9 years. Think about what that means. A young man walks into a laboratory, they measure the force his muscles can produce, they write it down, and then almost 2 decades of his life unfold. He changes jobs. His hair goes gray, and the whole time, quietly, the number they wrote down is doing its slow work of prediction whether he knows it or not. And when they finally looked, after all those years, after 503 of those men had died, they sorted them into 3 groups by strength. The weakest third, the middle third, the strongest third. And the strongest third had a risk of dying from any cause at all that was only about 3/4 of the weakest thirds. For heart death specifically, the strongest men sat at about 71 out of 100 compared to the weakest. That is a real gap. That is roughly 1/4 of the danger simply gone, associated with nothing more exotic than being able to push and pull harder against the world. Now I can already hear the objection, because it is a good objection, and I would raise it myself. You would say, Feynman, of course the strong men live longer. Strong men are probably the ones who exercise, and exercise helps the heart and the lungs, so you have not shown me that strength did anything. You have just shown me that healthy people are healthy. That is a fair thing to say, and the people running this study were not fools. They knew you would say it. So they did the careful thing. They went back into their numbers, and they subtracted out the effect of the men's cardiorespiratory fitness. They subtracted out how heavy the men were. They subtracted out whether they smoked. And, listen closely now, they subtracted out whether the men had high cholesterol. They pulled all of those threads out of the cloth, one by one, and asked whether strength still predicted who would live and who would die. And it did. After all of that scrubbing, the strong men still held their advantage. Which tells you something rather startling. It tells you that the strength of your muscles is carrying information about your future that is not contained in your cholesterol, and not even fully contained in how good your lungs are. It is a separate channel. A separate broadcast station sending out a signal about the state of your machinery on a frequency the blood test simply cannot receive. I want you to sit with that picture for a moment, because it is the quiet heart of this whole long talk. Your body is not one number. It is not the cholesterol on the slip. It is a set of overlapping systems, each of them shouting its own honest report about how well you are put together. And the tragedy of the last 50 years or so is that medicine got very good at listening to one of those reports and rather deaf to the others. The blood report is easy to take. You sit still, you offer your arm, a small vial fills, a machine hums, and out comes a tidy number you can print on paper. It is convenient. And convenience has a gravity to it. Things drift toward whatever is easy to measure, the way water finds the low place in a floor, and once everyone is standing in that low place, it feels like the only place there is. But strength does not fit in a vial. Endurance does not fit in a vial. The willingness of your blood vessels to open when they should does not fit in a vial. These things only show themselves when you ask your body to do something. You cannot photograph them. You have to make them perform. And that is the difference I keep circling back to. The difference between a photograph and a performance. A photograph of a still man tells you what he looks like. A performance tells you what he can do. And it is the doing that keeps him alive. Now let me take you inside the machinery, because I promised you the plumbing and the nerves, and I keep my promises. When you lower yourself against that wall and hold, and your thighs take up the load and begin, after a while, to burn and quiver, something specific is happening down in the muscle, at a scale far too small to feel directly. Threaded all through your muscle tissue are two kinds of tiny nerve endings, and I want you to think of them as two different kinds of spies. The first kind are the mechanical spies. They feel stretch and squeeze and tension, the physical deformation of the tissue, the way a fingertip feels a rope going taut. The second kind are the chemical spies. They taste the local broth. As a working muscle uses up its fuel and leaves behind its little waste products, the acidity shifts, and these spies taste that shift and send word upstairs. While you hold the wall sit, your muscle is squeezing itself so hard that it pinches shut a good many of its own small blood vessels. The muscle is, in a sense, strangling its own supply lines. And so the fuel keeps getting burned, but the fresh blood cannot fully get in, and the waste cannot fully get out, and the local broth grows richer and more acidic by the second. Both sets of spies, the mechanical and the chemical, start reporting furiously to the brain. Something is happening in the legs, they say. Send help. And the brain answers the only way it knows how in that moment. It tells the heart to pump harder and the vessels elsewhere to tighten so that pressure rises to force blood past the squeeze. That is why, during the hold itself, your blood pressure does not drift up politely. It climbs. In young healthy people, measured doing exactly this, the pressure went from a resting value of about 121/77 up to an average of 164/104. And in some, it touched 189/123 at the peak. Those are big numbers. And I know what you are thinking, because it is the sensible thing to think. You are thinking, wait, this exercise is supposed to be good for my blood pressure, and you are telling me it sends it soaring? How on earth can driving the pressure up be the road to bringing the pressure down? And there it is. That is the beautiful contradiction at the center of the whole thing, and it is exactly the kind of contradiction nature loves to hide her best tricks inside. The spike is not the medicine. The spike is the setup. The medicine comes after, when you let go. Because think about what happens the instant you stand up out of that wall, sit and release the muscle. All those small vessels you had been strangling suddenly spring open, and behind them the pressure had been building, all that held back blood waiting like a crowd behind a gate. Open the gate, and the blood does not trickle. It floods. It rushes through those newly opened vessels in a surge, far faster and far greater than the muscle's ordinary quiet resting flow. Your leg, in that moment, drinks. And here is the part that matters, the part that turns a moment of exercise into a lasting change. That flood of blood does not pass through the vessels gently. It scrapes along the inner lining of the vessel walls with real force, a kind of frictional dragging that the engineers call shear. Now, the inner lining of your blood vessels is not dead pipe. It is a living skin, a single delicate layer of cells, and that skin can feel the blood dragging across it. It is, in its own way, another kind of spy, one that reads the flow. And when it feels that hard, fast surge scraping over it, it responds by manufacturing a small, short-lived, wonderfully important molecule and releasing it into the vessel wall. That molecule tells the muscle wrapped around the vessel to relax, to let go, to widen. It is the body's own signal for open up and let the blood through easily. And so the very act of strangling the vessel during the hold and then releasing it teaches the vessel to open more freely afterward. You squeezed, you flooded, and the flood taught the pipe to relax. Do that again and again, 3 times a week, and the lining gets better and better at making that relaxing signal. quicker to produce it, more generous with it. The vessel becomes, over the weeks, a more willing and a more open thing. I am not finished with the machinery. There is a third step, deeper than the vessel wall, up in the wiring of the nervous system itself, where the truly durable change is written. But before I take you there, I want you to hold in your mind this simple, almost mischievous picture, because it overturns everything the still photograph told you. The pressure has to go up hard for a little while, so that afterward, for a long while, it can come down. The stress is the teacher, and there is not a lab test in the world that can hand you that lesson, because the lesson only exists in the doing. So let me take you up into the wiring, because this is where the story stops being about a single pipe and starts being about the whole household. Picture the body as a large house with water running through it, and somewhere in that house there is a thermostat. Not for heat, for pressure. Little patches of nerve endings sit in the walls of your big arteries up in the neck and near the heart, and all they do, all day and all night, is feel how hard the blood is pushing. They are stretch detectors. When the pressure rises, they stretch, and they send a signal up to the brain that says, "Easy now, back off." And the brain answers by loosening the vessels and gentling the heart. When the pressure falls, they stretch less, and they whisper, "A little more, please." And the brain tightens things up. This little loop is called the baroreceptor reflex, and it is running underneath everything, keeping you from fainting when you stand, keeping you from bursting when you strain. It has a set point. It defends a number. And here is the trouble with a body that sits still year after year. That set point drifts upward. The thermostat gets lazy, or worse, it gets recalibrated to defend a high pressure as though the high pressure were normal and correct. It stops complaining. It accepts the flood as the new baseline. That is a quiet catastrophe, because now the whole house is being run at a pressure that is slowly wearing out the walls, and the very alarm that should be screaming has been talked into silence. Now watch what the holding does to that lazy thermostat. During the wall sit, as I told you, the pressure climbs up into the region of 160/100, sometimes higher, and those stretch detectors are stretched hard. They fire like mad. They are wide awake. And you do this to them again and again, 3 times a week, a brief loud alarm followed by a long quiet afterward, and something rather wonderful happens. The reflex sharpens. It becomes more sensitive. A given rise in pressure now produces a bigger corrective response than it used to. The thermostat, which had been dozing, becomes a light sleeper again. Quick to notice, quick to act. In the Trained Men in That Sports Medicine review from 2024, this sensitivity went up by roughly 16-fold. 16 times more responsive than before. In the women it rose too, by about 3.5-fold, still a real and useful change, just of a different size, and we do not fully know why the two differ so much, so I will not pretend to. But the direction is the same for everybody. You take a sluggish, over-tolerant pressure regulator, and you wake it up. You give it back its nerve. And there is a third thread woven in with that one, running out along the sympathetic nerves, the ones that carry the brain's tightening orders down to the blood vessels. We have a name for the traffic on those particular wires that go to muscle. We call it muscle sympathetic nerve activity, and you can think of it plainly as how insistently the brain is holding your vessels clenched. In a still life, an unexercised life, that clenching tends to run high. A constant background tension, a fist that never quite opens. What the training does, over weeks, is turn that traffic down. The brain sends fewer of those tightening pulses at rest, the fist unclenches. And because the vessels are the pipes, and the clench is the squeeze on the pipes, turning down the clench means the whole system offers less resistance to the flow. Lower resistance at the same output from the heart means lower pressure. That is not a metaphor. That is arithmetic. Pressure is flow times resistance, and you have lowered the resistance, so the pressure comes down and stays down. Not because you took anything, but because you retrained the nerve. So now you have the full machine in front of you, all 3 stages of it. During the hold, you occlude and you provoke, and the little sensors in the muscle, the ones sensitive to squeeze and the ones sensitive to the burn, they set off the alarm and the pressure rises. On the release, the flood comes, and the rushing blood scours the lining and coaxes it into making that relaxing gas, so the pipe learns to open. And underneath both of those, invisible, patient, the thermostat sharpens and the background clench eases, so that the resting number, the one you actually live at, settles lower week upon week. 3 doors, and the holding opens all 3 at once. Try to find me the lab test that opens even one of them. There isn't one. The blood draw measures a level, it does not move a set point. It cannot teach a vessel to relax, or a nerve to loosen, or a thermostat to wake, it only reports. The holding does. And now let me show you what that machine produces when you actually run it, not in a diagram but in real people with real hypertension. Cohen and his colleagues in 2023 in the Journal of Clinical Hypertension took 77 adults who had high blood pressure and were on no medicine for it. The average age was near 45, and about 2 out of every 3 were men. They gave them nothing to swallow. No pill, no supplement, no diet sheet. They gave them a wall. 4 holds of 2 minutes each, knees bent to about 95 degrees, a couple of minutes of rest between the holds, 3 days a week. 12 weeks of that. And at the end, the group doing the wall squats had dropped their top number, their systolic pressure, by nearly 13 points. 12.9 to be exact. The people who did nothing changed by 0.4 of a point, which is to say they did not change at all. Let that sit for a moment in the dark. 13 points off the pressure from leaning on a wall for a few minutes 3 times a week for 3 months. When they narrowed in on the wall squat by itself in the 2024 review, they found a drop of around 11.5 points on the top number and about 5 on the bottom. These are not small effects. These are the kinds of numbers that, in a drug, would make somebody very rich. And the whole prescription, added up across a week, comes to something like 14 minutes of actual holding. 14 minutes. Less time than a single episode of almost anything you might watch of an evening. You could not brew a pot of coffee and drink it in the time this asks of you across a week, and yet it moves a number that we have spent a century trying to move with chemistry. I want to stay with the smallness of that, because it is the part that seems almost unfair. When we think of exercise strong enough to reshape the heart and the arteries, we picture sweat and distance and lungs on fire, an hour on the road, a mountain of effort. The picture is of quantity. More miles, more minutes, more suffering. But the holding does not trade in quantity. It trades in a very particular kind of stress, delivered in a very particular way, and the dose that works is astonishingly slight. It is quality of stimulus, not quantity of labor. You are not trying to burn something off. You are trying to send a signal, a clear and unmistakable signal, to the vessels and the nerves, and it turns out the signal does not need to be long. It needs to be right. Squeeze hard enough to occlude, hold long enough to provoke the flood, then let go and let the machinery do the teaching. 4 times. Rest. Go home. The lesson keeps working long after you have stopped. And that, the part about the lesson working long after you have stopped, is the next thing I have to show you, because it is stranger than you would guess. You might imagine that the benefit of a session lives inside the session, that while you are holding, good things happen, and when you stand up and walk away, it all switches off, like a light when you leave a room. That is not what happens at all. After a bout of this isometric work, the pressure does not merely return to where it was. It sinks below where it was, and it stays down there low and easy for a remarkably long stretch. In some of the measurements, this lowered pressure after exercise persists for up to 22 hours. Nearly a full turn of the clock. You lean on a wall for a few minutes in the morning, and your arteries are still running gentler when you lie down that night. What is holding them there? The noradrenaline, the body's own tightening chemical, drops. The sympathetic outflow, that clenching traffic on the nerves, stays inhibited. And the vessels stay dilated, still relaxed from the flood. So a single session is not a single moment of benefit. It is a shield that follows you through most of a day, quietly lowering the load on every arterial wall in your body while you go about your business, forgetting entirely that you did anything at all. And when they compared where that afterglow comes from, the wall squat, which calls on the great muscles of the thighs and the seat and the back of the legs, all that heavy tissue at once, produce the largest drop in the minutes right after the hold, larger than squeezing a hand grip, larger than a single straightening of the knee against resistance. The more muscle you occlude, the bigger the flood, and the bigger the flood, the deeper and longer the calm that follows. The champion move is the one that shuts down the most plumbing at once, so that the reopening is a torrent, and the torrent is the teacher, and the lesson lasts almost until you would need to give it again.